Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Spring Split, or Split number 2, Primer and Power Rankings video. I'm super excited to get into this one, whatever you want to end up calling this second split, whether it's the Spring Split for you, or Split 2, which is what they categorize it, I think, officially. We are in kind of the middle of the year for the LPL, the middle of the year for LOL Esports. We're coming off of the First Stand International Tournament, where obviously the LPL did not perform in the way that a lot of people wanted them to. Finishing, below second at that tournament is a disaster, and quite frankly, there is a case to be made that they were maybe the worst individually performing region at that entire tournament, just in terms of the actual quality of gameplay that we saw from them. It really was about as bad as it could possibly be, and so I think there are going to be a lot of eyes on the LPL going into spring here, going into this second split, seeing if they can either, turn things around in terms of, seeing some more consistent gameplay, or if we're going to see new teams rise to the top with some underperformances and maybe some things going wrong in the winter split. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you think of the LPL going into this next split? What teams do you think might overperform expectations? What teams do you think might underperform expectations? Of course, we'll be going over everything. We'll be power ranking every single team. We'll be talking about every single player, all of the normal primer stuff. Honestly, it's not going to be quite as in-depth, maybe not quite as long as some of the other primer videos that we've done, because there are quite a few teams here that have only played 3 best-of-5s so far, at least in terms of non-preseason action in 2025, so not a ton has changed in terms of perception for at least the bad teams in the league, but we will definitely kind of go over the groups, what we could expect, and maybe some potential breakout candidates moving into this split. But the first thing I really want to talk about when it comes to the LPL second split is the format, because I do think that there are a lot of questions and a lot of complications when it comes to the format. People who watched the summer split of last year should be familiar with the general concept of what is happening in the LPL. 4 groups, Group A, B, C, and D, that then disperse into Group Ascend and Group Nirvana. But the difference is it's a very difficult process this time around, and it's a very weird group stage, and we'll kind of go over it here very quickly. So obviously, just like last summer, if you were watching the LPL, you've got the 4 groups. Top 2 end up placing for Group Ascend. Bottom 2 do not end up placing for Group Ascend. The only difference is last time the bottom 2 teams immediately went into Group Nirvana. This time there's actually going to be a last chance qualifier, a play-in for the Group Ascend. If you're in 4th place, you're automatically in Group Nirvana, but if you're in 3rd place, you go into a 4-team little bracket tournament where 2 of those teams will qualify for Group Ascend, the other 2 will go down into Group Nirvana. So just to quickly go over it, the top 2 teams, Group Ascend will consist of the top 2 teams from all 4 groups, so that's 8 teams there, and then the 2 teams that qualify out of the last chance qualifier. Group Nirvana will consist of all of the teams that get last in their group, as well as the 2 teams that do not get out of the last chance qualifier. I know that that's kind of convoluted and confusing, but at the end of the day, that's just how it ends up working out. And then we go into Group Ascend and Group Nirvana, which I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with. Oh, I should also point out, for the actual group stage, Group A, B, C, and D, this is double round robin, best of 1. This is not best of 3. It's certainly not best of 5 like the group stage was last split. These teams are all playing on one specific day. There's 8 days of the group stage. They're all back to back to back to back, and they're all going to be, playing 3 best of 1s on their given group day. So it's definitely a much more jam-packed and kind of, I guess, compacted format, just in general, and we'll talk about what that means for some of these teams as we go throughout the groups. But once we do get into Group Ascend and Group Nirvana, this is going to be double round robin best of 3 for Group Ascend at the very least, and then it's going to be single round robin best of 3 for Group Nirvana. At first, when I saw this, I thought they had it backwards, but it looks like the group with more teams will be double round robin, and the group with less teams will be single round robin. Very strange there, but then we start to get into playoff qualification. The top 4 teams from Group Ascend are immediately slotted into the playoffs. The bottom 6 teams will go into this play-in style round robin, I guess single series, in order to try and qualify to get those final 4 spots in what is an 8-team playoff. So it's going to be the bottom 6 teams from Group Ascend taking on the top 2 teams from Group Nirvana. They will be seeded based off of their performances in these group stages. So the team that ends up in 5th place in Group Ascend will be the highest rated. The team that ends up in 2nd place in Group Nirvana will be the lowest rated. They'll face off against each other, so on and so forth. And I believe it's just a single best of 5 5 to qualify for the actual playoffs. And then we finally get to the playoffs, which is, of course, the 8 teams, the 4 teams from Group Ascend and the 4 teams that win their play-in series. And then they just have like a double elimination bracket to see who ends up winning the playoffs and, you know, representing their region at MSI. I still believe it's the top 2 teams that go to MSI to represent the LPL. One thing that is important to note, if you finish bottom 2 in Group Nirvana, if you are a team in an org that ends up in the Group Nirvana with those 6 teams and you are, you know, 15th or 16th, you're not just done for the split, you're done for the season. If you are a bottom 2 team in Nirvana, you don't get to play in summer. I'm going to talk about this format just in general, like as a big whole right now, but this is really the thing that I hate. Like, I can't possibly see a reason why you would ever do this, why there is ever an excuse for eliminating a team for the rest of the year after, you know, only playing what is essentially going to be 6 best of 1s and then, 5 best of 3s? Like, all of a sudden you play those and you're done for the year if you're not good enough at that point. I think this is ridiculous. First of all, this format itself is so overly complicated, is so overly convoluted, is so jam-packed into such a short amount of time that I can't say that it's anything other than psychotic. Like, I don't know who came up with this, but this is taking a problem that didn't really exist. Like, I can understand that people weren't happy with the regular season format because there were too many games that didn't matter, but it's taking an issue that was only kind of a problem and like actively tinkering with it so much that you've dived it into the worst direction. We've talked about this so much around the world. I think literally every single region has just gotten worse and worse and worse in terms of its format. I don't think I'm alone in feeling that way. I know there are some people who like this format, and I'm sure there are going to be people in the comments that defend it. Totally fine if you like it. I'm just expressing my opinion that 2 teams getting eliminated from summer split based off of their performances in spring is ridiculous and stupid because the teams already exist. Why would you not just have them play games? It's absolutely ludicrous to eliminate 2 organizations from organized play for the back half of the year. And even on top of that, like, the rest of this format is so jam-packed. It's like, I cannot stress enough. This format all takes place over the course of like 3 to 4 weeks. Like, everything you see on this screen is like 3 to 4 weeks. We're getting, you know, 8 best of 1s or 6 best of 1s per day for 8 straight days, and then immediately going into a double round robin for Group Ascend with 10 teams. Like, that's all happening over 2 weeks. Like, we're actively getting, you know, multiple, like 3 to 4 best of 3s a day in the LPL. It's just a ridiculous format. I don't really understand why we would ever do it like this. And once again, you know, it's overcomplicating the problem, but I've gone on long enough about the format. Hopefully you at least understand it, because that's the context behind what we're going to be referring to the rest of this video on. You know, when I talk about a team being top 2, or a team that I think would be, you know, big favorites to be top 4 in Group Ascend, or a team that I think is likely to be 4th place in their group, like, that's the context behind it, where you don't want to be 4th, and you do want to probably be a top 4 team in Group Ascend in order to make sure that you can auto-qualify for the playoffs, that you don't have to play that play-in series. So all of that being said, that's the format out of the way. We're 8 minutes into this video, and I already talked about this one being shorter, so I have to start living up to my promise. Let's get into the actual content itself, and that's going to start off with going group by group. Of course, as you saw in the format, it's Group A, it's Group B, it's Group C, and Group D. We're going to be going from bottom to top in terms of my personal power rankings and projections for these groups, and so the team that I expect to get 4th place, I'll talk about first, and then 3rd place, and then 2nd place, and then 1st place as we go group by group. And we're going to start, of course, with Group A. And if we're going to be starting off with the team that I expect to be the worst in Group A, this is a pretty easy decision. This team was incredibly bad in the winter split. We all knew their offseason was laughably bad. They were kind of the meme of this channel for anybody who followed in the offseason, and they continue to be the team I rank at the bottom of my power rankings. I have Team WE being the team that I expect to get last in Group A. I really see no reason that this team would do anything better than this, but quickly going over what you're seeing on the screen to kind of give context as to, you know, where we are and like what you can expect for the rest of this video in terms of the graphics. Obviously, at the top, you can see the team name, the number, in this case, number 16, next to the team is going to indicate where I personally power rank that team from number 1 to number 16. In WE's case, I think they're the worst team in the LPL. Therefore, I have them at number 16. In quotations is going to be how that has changed from my primer in the spring split, or in the winter split, I should say. So WE gets an equals because I had them last going into winter. I still have them last going into spring. If a team has moved up or down in those power rankings, then that will be indicated there. You can see their winter record. In WE's case, they went 1-9 across their 3 best of 5s. They got 4th place in Group A. That's why it says A4. And then obviously they're in Group A now as well, again, for the upcoming split. As for all of the players, course, they're going to be listed across there. Any asterisks will just denote that they are an import. So Karis and Taiyun in this case are imports, and therefore they get the asterisks next to them. The number below each player is where I personally power rank them within their individual position. So like I have Cube as the number 15 top laner out of all the starting top laners in the league. That's down 1 from what he was in winter. Again, very similar to the power ranking number. You're just going to see how my opinion on these players has changed, or how my opinion on the room has changed, because there are some player swaps, like some roster changes that have happened going in to the spring split. In this case, Monkey is coming in here in the jungle. You can see that with the new underneath the player ratings. That's just going to denote whether the player is a new starter, and we'll talk about those individually, but he is being compared not to himself or anything from last split, but to specifically to WE's jungle last split. So he's in this case a -1 because Tianjin was number 13 going into winter, and Monkey is now number 14 going into spring. So the team, in my opinion, has a worse outlook going into the spring split. That is so much posturing and you know, talking about what is happening in this video, but now hopefully it should be done for the rest of the video. We can just start talking about these teams and these players. And again, anybody who's followed the channel knows that WE was going to be coming in at number 16. This is not a surprise to anybody who's been watching my LPL content throughout this year. This team sucks. They're easily the worst team in the LPL. They had their chance to prove that they were not by going up against LGD Gaming in Group A, who I consider to be the other weakest team in the entire league, and they still lost to them, and they lost to them pretty convincingly. There's really no reason to believe this team is going to get any better. They were a meme in the offseason for a reason, because they basically looked around the entire world and said, who does K-Man hate the most in terms of the players in the LPL and the LCK, and how can we get them on our team? And it's playing out exactly as you would expect. They are absolutely horrific, and they cannot win games. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup, at least for spring, is looking like Cube in the top lane, Monkey in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Taiyun at AD carry, and Vampire at support. Only new addition here is going to be Monkey, and honestly, I don't hate this change. Like, Tianjin is the only player that I was even remotely excited about for WE going into this year, because he did have a really good end of 2024 on OMG, but because he is the one player that actually brought some level of excitement to this team, they were like, we can't have that, we got to replace him. Monkey is another player who I think has had some flashes at the LPL level when he was filling in for Jeja last year on Edward Gaming. I think that there were definitely some times where he looked like he was a competent jungler at this level. But to pretend like he's some sort of guaranteed good player or finished product is ridiculous. He was filling in for a very good jungler and doing, you know, some interesting plays, but he was also super feast or famine. Honestly, I would consider this a side grade from Tianjin. I think generally the jungle position has gotten better going into this split, or at least there's one player that has skyrocketed up the rankings. You can probably guess who. And Monkey is only falling one spot, you know, from what Tianjin was, because I think generally some players are just a little bit higher rated than maybe I had them going into winter. But the difference between Monkey and Tianjin is basically negligible. I don't think they're the exact same player, but both of them are very aggressive in the early game, very flippy, very feast or famine type of junglers. They're going to try and gain advantages for the team, which is good, because I don't think anybody else in this team is winning any games for you, but they're definitely not going to be the most consistent pieces in the world. That being said, this team still will live or die by whether or not the rest of them can be even remotely close to league average, like even if they can be slightly below league average. That was not the case in the winter split. And in fact, you can see the bottom side of this map, 16s across the board. Karis, I have as the worst mid laner in the LPL. Even if he did have a couple of interesting games, his ability to be like a game winner is just non-existent. Like, he has been given so many chances at top levels in the LCK and in the LPL, and he's just never been anything other than a significantly below average mid laner in basically every statistical category. In the film very much backs that up. I would say it's even worse on film than it is statistically. You have Taiyun and Vampire, who are easily the worst bot lane in the LPL. Taiyun, spoiler alert, like, I'm not giving out grades here. I will talk about some of my letter grades as we go throughout, but Taiyun, still the only player that I have as like a D graded player in the LPL. He is the single worst player in the LPL. The fact that he has a starting job in a major region is still unbelievable to me, considering just how bad he's looked everywhere he has played, whether it's been KDF over in the LCK or now here WE. He is yet to have a single, like, even remotely close to average game at this level. He's just so outclassed. He's not a player that I expect to ever get better. Like, there's no reason to have Taiyun starting, especially taking up an import slot. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And then Vampire, he continues to show flashes, but what I continue to say about the people who defend Vampire and, you know, Reddit who's super in on Vampire is, like, you can be excited about these inconsistent, really good teamfight engages all you want and like these interesting plays in the mid game. If he's making 1 or 2 good plays a game and making 10 bad ones, that's the worst support in the league. I don't care how like interesting the good plays look. If you cannot limit bad plays, it doesn't matter how good the good plays are. We have seen this over and over again from quote unquote interesting supports. You can have the mechanical or even the mental like aspect down, and you can have a couple of these good plays down. If you're going to make mistake after mistake in the mid game and in the late game specifically, if you're a bad laner as well on top of that, there's just no way you can be a productive player at this level. He'll have good games every once in a while, but like he is like a slightly worse version of a player like Jin Zhao for so many years for LGD. For LPL fans out there, Jin Zhao like obviously played support for LGD for a little while over the past couple of years. Vampire is kind of like that, where he'll have a couple of games every so often that look kind of interesting, but he's worse. Like, he is worse than what Jin Zhao was overall. Vampire is just not a good player. And again, maybe there is upside there. This guy was thrown into the fire a lot quicker than he needed to be because EDG lost Mako last year and Invictus Gaming traded for him, seeing some semblance of upside, but things have just not worked out. Again, maybe Vampire turns into a slightly below average league support at some time, but it's just not there right now. And then you have Cube on the top side. I don't know what else there is to say about Cube. He was out of the league because he didn't want to play pro anymore, and somehow this team convinced him to come back. He's not good. Like, he's a bad weak side top laner. He can sometimes play strong side nowadays, but like the version of Cube that was on Rare Atom, where he was like an elite weak side top laner and, you know, somebody who didn't need resources in order to be relevant, that guy's like 5 years gone. Like, it is just not there anymore. Cube is not a good top laner. To me, the jungle position is the only even remotely interesting part of this team. Maybe support can turn into something, but like Monkey is the only player on this team that I see having any semblance of like ability to win games, and that's a problem because Monkey's not a particularly good player. So I would expect WE to pretty clearly not only be like the worst team in Group A, but I imagine when they get last place in Group A and go to Group Nirvana, they're probably the weakest team in Group Nirvana as well. WE is likely to be one of the 2 teams that does not get to play in the summer split, and for an org that is so prestigious in the LPL, that is a bit of a shame. But then moving on to the team that I think will get 3rd here in Group A, and unfortunately for this team, I think they could be better than like a 3rd place finish, and this is a team that I would be looking out for to potentially make the actual playoffs from the play-ins itself. It's Edward Gaming. I think it's pretty clear that they have to come in at number 3 in terms of projections in this group. The top 2 teams are both incredibly good, and it's going to be very difficult to break through that, but they are clearly better than WE, and I have a pretty sinking suspicion this is pretty obviously going to be a top 9 or so team, top 8 or so team in the LPL. There's certainly a top 10 team on paper in the LPL. I think that there are reasons to believe that they will be better than they were in the winter split, where they did kind of underperform. I think they made a roster change that I like and that I think made the team better, and we can kind of go over it now. Of course, their lineup is looking like ZDZ in the top lane, Zhao Hao in the jungle, Angel in the mid lane, On now at AD carry, and Wink at support. I would give this team a lot of credit for going out and saying, Assume's not really working, let's go and get On, who is a player that absolutely should not have been teamless at the start of the year. Let's go ahead and pick him up, reunite him with Wink, and see if we can get a really good bot lane. I would give this team credit for that, but you have to remember, they're the team that dropped On last year anyways. Like, the fact that On wasn't on this team to start the year, the fact that they ever dropped On for Assume in the first place was absolutely ridiculous. To anybody who watched the LPL for the past couple of years, you know that On was like sneakily one of the better AD carries in the entire region. This guy has been mega consistent for basically the last 2 years. After really struggling out of the gate as a pro player, he has found his footing, he has found his niche, and especially with Wink last year, like, this guy was a borderline all-pro caliber AD carry at times for a team that desperately needed somebody to be able to win them games. They had absolutely nobody on this team that could win them games. They acquire him mid-year, and it's a massive upgrade for them, and they somehow make the decision in the offseason to go to Assume, who's not an awful player, but On is clearly the better AD carry, and obviously they're rectifying that mistake now because nobody was bold enough to, go out and pick On up, but there is no reason for On to have been a free agent in the first place, and I do think this is a big upgrade. They're going to jump up 3 spots. He's my number 7 AD carry in the LPL, and if you know, like, the LPL AD carry list, that's really high. That is above some players that people are going to get frustrated are below On, but at the end of the day, it's not that I don't value those other players, it's that I think people are undervaluing how good On is as an AD carry, how he can do basically anything out of that role, how consistent he's been, and just how much of an upgrade I think this will be. Hopefully, he's actually good in spring spring, you know, he's going to be coming into a team that probably had more of a set dynamic, and he's going to have to integrate. It can be difficult to join a team mid-split, even if you are a good player. So, you know, we're going to have to hope that On can come in and really revitalize EDG, but it's going to be difficult. Like I said, the two teams at the top of this group, in Group A that we'll talk about a bit later, they're really good. Like, they are very, very good teams. And so could On be a top 5 AD carry? He certainly was last year, in my opinion. Do I think he will be that this year? I think it's a little bit more difficult to project that. But, you know, having Wink as a support, I think, is still a positive. Wink was one of the players that I think was playing fine for EDG, although I don't think he was playing at his absolute best. EDG had quite a few problems in the winter split. They really underperformed in multiple stages of the map. I think the top side just wasn't good enough. Like, ZDZ is not a particularly good top laner. You can see that in terms of him coming in as the number 13 top laner. And once again, if this team is going to be held back, it's likely because ZDZ is their top laner. We continuously see this with teams with Xiao Hao on it in particular, where for some reason these two are just glued at the hip and want to play together everywhere. Xiao Hao is actually a good jungler, somebody who can make an impact at this level, but because he's bringing ZDZ along on the top side, like, every team he plays for just continuously gets worse because they have a top laner that continuously drags the team down, and that looks like it's going to be the case once again for Edward Gaming. Even at the end of last year for FunPlus Phoenix, ZDZ was looking like a, you know, a fine weak side top laner, but nothing spectacular. Every other stop in his career, he's been underwhelming. I imagine that will continue. Angel also had a couple of moments in the mid lane where I just wasn't super thrilled with how he played in the winter split. You know, he's been very good, I would say, over the past 2 years. Maybe not the most consistent player in the world for OMG last year, but I was a huge fan of his time on Ninjas in Pyjamas. I was very clear about that on this channel. Him and Shadow had ridiculously good chemistry together, and his spring split on OMG was pretty solid, even when the rest of that team was, like, absolutely dissolving. And obviously when the team got better, when OMG started to win in Group Nirvana last summer, he was a big part of that as well. I think Angel can still be like a league average mid laner, which is exactly what you need here for Edward Gaming if you're going to allow On and Xiao Hao to be kind of primary carries for this team. But he does need to start stabilizing in lane a bit more. A lot of the big advantages Angel has been able to get over his career have been in team fights because he is a good team fighter. His laning stats were not good at all in winter. That has to get better. Again, we already talked about it, but Xiao Hao is a very good carry jungler. And the good thing for EDG, and the thing that could probably give them a bit more credence and a bit more, you know, comfort in their brain, is that Xiao Hao traditionally gets better throughout the year. He almost always plays better in summer than he does in spring. We'll see if he plays better in spring than he did in winter. He really wasn't all that great in winter. He kind of just was an average jungler. You want more out of him. There was a reason that Weibo Gaming was willing to pick him up last year, even if they did replace him with Tarzan by the end of the year. It's because he deserves to be on a top tier team with the talent and the carry potential that he has. We just need to see him do it for a larger stretch of time. Hopefully that can be this spring. But again, even with all of these things kind of pushing in their favor, I think their bot lane's going to be way better. I think On could be a primary option for them. Xiao Hao should be better. I think Angel might have a more defined role now that their bot lane is getting better, and, you know, hopefully ZDZ can be weak side top lane. Like, all of these things are good and, you know, kind of put them around that top 8-ish conversation. The issue for Edward Gaming is that they're in a group with two really good teams, and it's basically impossible for them to get top 2. We'll see. Obviously, upsets can happen, but I think there is a real possibility that they are, like, clearly a top 10 team in the LPL, that they end up getting third in this group, going into that, you know, play-in style 4-team tournament of the third place teams in the groups and actually getting into Group Ascend. I think that that's pretty possible for this team, and honestly, at least in terms of how much I think they upgraded by bringing On back here and how much I think the rest of the team will get better because of that, that would be my expectation for them. Maybe not auto-qualifying, but getting into Group Ascend based off that tournament. And then coming in at second in Group A for me, or projected second, this one was also pretty obvious. It's going to be Weibo Gaming, who I have as number 5 in my power rankings. This is exactly where I had them going into the year, and I think this is exactly where they kind of finished in the spring split, or in the winter split, I should say. I'm going to screw that up so many times throughout this video. You're just going to have to, you know, be patient with me when it comes to that. I'm not used to a winter split in the LPL, but this team had an absolutely horrific run of things in terms of luck in the winter split. They got the absolute worst possible matchups. They end up getting second in their group because they're in the same group as, oh, I don't know, maybe just the team that ends up finishing third in the entire league in LGD Gaming, but that's all right. Like, Top Esports finished second, and they went on to win the title. You can go on a lower bracket run. Who did they draw in round number 1? I'm sure it's a very beatable team, right? No, Bilibili Gaming randomly drops a series to Thunder Talk, so they're in the first round of the playoffs, and now Weibo has to beat the defending champions, and they can't do that. This is still a really good team. They just got really unlucky in terms of the teams that they had to face early on in the tournament, and I think that that is gonna show. I think it's gonna show itself. I was actually really impressed by how this team ended up playing throughout a majority of winter. I think that they were exactly what I thought that they were going to be, and that is a team that plays entirely around jungle, can facilitate that with some really aggressive gameplay coming in from the solo lanes. Bot lane's gonna be super consistent and have some high upsides because Hong is a really good player, and again, Tion's gonna pop off. That's exactly what Weibo Gaming was in winter, and I was really excited to see it. Tion is awesome. He continues to be awesome for Weibo Gaming. Again, I know there are some concerns from LPL fans who have turned on basically every jungler that's ever existed in the LPL that Tion is a choker in big moments. I think obviously outside of the top esports system, you never really know what's going to happen to a player, but this is a guy that at least domestically in the playoffs has performed pretty consistently throughout his career. I have no reason to believe that in terms of a domestic ranking here, he's going to hold this team back from being top 3 or top 4. But I think if you are concerned about Weibo's upside, a lot of that is going to come down to the solo laners, and I agree with that. I think Breathe and Xiaohu are the part of the team that need to be good enough in order for this team to get across the finish line. Light and Hong, I feel good about. Tion, I think, is a world-class jungler, one of the top 5 in the world, and I think he continuously proved that last split, even if Weibo didn't have the results that they were looking for. But Breathe has taken a bit of a dip in terms of my reputation of him. I think at this point, it's pretty clear that he is a good, not great top laner, at least at a world-class level. Obviously, when he's going up against like the middle to lower tier top laners in the LPL, he's going to look pretty fantastic, but he's just going to have some unnecessarily bad games against good teams that really hold me back from saying that he's in the conversation for being a top 3 or top 4 top laner. He's just not there anymore. I have him number 6 in terms of my top lane rankings. Obviously, top lane is a little bit different going into this split than it was going into the year because, you know, a player like Flandre played a lot better than maybe we were anticipating, and just naturally some people are going to move down the rankings because of that, but I just don't really have a ton of confidence that Breathe is going to be anything more than a good, not great top laner for this team. And you could say a very similar thing for Xiaohu at this point in his career. He's just way too flippy for me to feel all that comfortable. I will say Tion and Xiaohu seem to have pretty decent mid-jungle chemistry in the winter split. If that's going to be able to maintain, if these two are going to be able to play off of each other well, and Tion is going to be able to generate advantages based off of Xiaohu's like lane pressure, that's good. But the problem is Xiaohu's not a good laner. Like, he is one of the weaker laners in the entire league. I would say that he's bottom 4 in the mid lane position. The only reason he comes in at number 7 is because he still is an absolutely elite team fighter. He just is so bad at the first 15 minutes of the game that it's very difficult for him to get there. Now, he was better in winter than he was in 2024, which was necessary for this team, but it is still a concern because it's not like it's a one-off that Xiaohu's been a bad laner. Even in his prime, he was an average laner and the best team fighter in the world. Now, he's a bad laner and a really good team fighter, and that's just not quite as valuable. But like I said, bot lane does give me some confidence, some positives. Light and Hong are good players. Light only drops a spot because there's another AD carry that popped off in winter and that I had to raise into the top 5, but Light is still essentially a top 5 AD carry. Like, he's going to be super consistent, and he will probably outperform at least one of the AD carries that are above him in these rankings. I just don't really know who that's going to be yet. I'm not trying to disrespect Light by putting him at number 6. There are just so many good or great AD carries in the LPL. You don't need me to tell you that. You know how many good AD carries are in the LPL. Some positions are just not created equally. AD carry is not created equally. And then Hong's still going to come in as my number 3 support. Some people were getting critical of him because he was kind of flippy in the group stage of winter. I think that's what this team really needed. I think they needed another primary playmaker. Hong is just so adaptable, and he's been so consistent over the course of his career. I think he's like a slightly better version of what Crisp is as a support for top esports. Maybe not quite as creative in terms of the flank angles he can provide, but he's not going to be nearly as feast or famine in that regard. You kind of know what you're going to get out of Hong. The only times he's ever going to be feast or famine is when the team actually does need to be able to create. So I feel good about Weibo Gaming. Again, I think their playstyle is pretty structured. I think Tion naturally is just going to win them games because he's so good and so greedy at being able to take resources away from players and teams that he is just straight up a lot better than, and I think that will always put him into good spots in the regular season. I imagine this will pretty clearly be a top 2 team in the group. Could I see a world where they lose a best of 1 to Edward Gaming? I could see that being possible, but because it is double round robin in the best of 1 stage, I cannot see a world where they go 0-2 against EDG, and I would imagine with the other tiebreakers, they're probably going to be in a better spot. So I would expect this team to be able to move on as a top 2 team. I still think they're a top 5 team in the LPL. This is a team that, just like the past couple of years, will be competing for international spots, and who knows, maybe they go on a playoff run, but at least for now, I think that their performance in winter was not indicative of how good this team is. I think they got pretty unlucky when it came to their group draw and when it came to their playoff draw, and I think that they will make amends to that here in spring. But that's going to bring us to my number one team in Group A, and you can probably guess who this is. I don't think this is going to come as a shock to people, but it might come as a shock to see where I personally power rank this team. It's Bilibili Gaming coming in at the top of Group A. I expect them to be able to win this group. Honestly, they should probably go 6-0 in this group in terms of how good this team is, but you might be surprised to see they're still number one in my power rankings. I get that this team finished 4th in the winter split. I get that they lost at best of 5 to Top Esports. They lost at best of 5 to Thunder Talk in the group stage. This is not a perfect team by any stretch, and their flaws are very clear at this point. But if you're asking me who would I bet on to be the best team in the spring split, I'm betting on Bilibili Gaming. I think they still have the best roster. I imagine that a lot of these players are going to play better than they did in the winter split because their track records are just way too long to be what they were in the very small sample size of winter. And I think that even with the playstyle concerns, because I don't think this team is synergistic, I still think they are talented enough to be able to come out on top if you give them a little bit more time to get acclimated and to get used to playing with each other in the way that they probably want to play with each other. So we'll go ahead and kind of explain it as we continue to go along. Of course, their lineup has been in the top lane, Wei in the jungle, Knight in the mid lane, LGD carry, and On at support. There are going to be some positional movements here that are going to surprise some people. I think On moving up to number 1 is going to shock a lot of people. I don't want On as the number 1 support. I don't even think On played all that well in the winter split, but the problem is most supports underperformed in winter. But you can basically look down the line and see a bunch of supports who just were not like super consistent in winter. And when you're asking me, okay, who reflects best going into spring, I still think that On has the highest upside of all of those players. Whether you want it to be Mako, who was really underwhelming on Invictus Gaming, or Hong, who we just talked about for Weibo Gaming, or someone like Crisp on Top Esports, I just would take On over all of those players. And so for now, he is going to come in as number 1 in my support rankings. If you wanted to put him at number 4, honestly, he's really not all that different from a lot of the other players that I have around him in the rankings. Even someone like Kale on Anyone's Legend, who I think really broke out this past split. I shouldn't say broke out, because I've been talking about him for years, but you know, On is not like guaranteed number 1. If you feel frustrated by this number, don't take it all that seriously. But he is certainly a reason why I think this team will get better. I think Elk and On still have a case to be made that they are the best 2v2 lane in the world. I certainly think that there are other lanes that have really stepped up and, you know, made the argument for that. Most notably, obviously, Viper and Delight, who have been absolutely unbelievable for Hanwha Life over in the LCK, but they've also been pretty inconsistent themselves. I think Elk and On, there is a real shot that they come out here in the spring split and just absolutely decimate some teams and really start popping off now that they're closer to the middle of the year, and now especially that they underperformed. Like, they might have a fire lit under them, and I can imagine that 2v2 kind of prowess that they had last year where they were just the best in the world by far, just coming back and being very difficult to deal with. I think you have the 2 best solo laners in the LPL. In fact, I don't even really think it's all that close in terms of what I would expect. Knight still comes in easily as not only my number 1 mid laner in the LPL, but my number 1 player in the LPL. And I don't know, that might piss some people off, but I still think Knight is the player to have in the LPL. He's been the most successful player in the LPL, especially in the last, like, 3 or 4 years, but maybe of all time, like, in terms of the dominant run that he has been on, whether it's been on Top Esports, whether it's been on LGD Gaming, and now, of course, on Bilibili Gaming. There's just no reason to believe that Knight will not continue to be one of the best players in the world, and I think he might even get his mojo back. He was starting to play a lot better by the end of the playoffs. He did get a little bit outplayed by Cream. I shouldn't say a little bit. He got outplayed by Cream in that playoff series where they ended up getting eliminated, but you have to remember he was dominant in the playoffs up until that point, completely gapping Xiaohu and absolutely obliterating Satab, like making it not even remotely close in the rematch between those two. So I think Knight's going to be just fine, and I think Bin is going to be just fine. Again, I'm not doubting Bin. I still think he has all of the tools and all of the potential needed to be the best top laner in the world. In fact, he might still be considered the best top laner in the world. I just don't think he played like that in that specific series against Top Esports. He was really good throughout the group stage and throughout the playoffs up until that point. It was just that one series against 369 where he underperformed, and I think people are going to be looking at that. I don't think that happens twice in a row. I think Bin is going to be just fine, and again, I still consider him to be maybe the best top laner in the world. Again, Zeus is absolutely on a tear for Hanwha Life right now, but he's certainly within the conversation. That only leaves one player to talk about, and that is Wei in the jungle, who's going to fall yet another spot to number 6. People were upset in my comment section with my winter primer when I put Wei below Shun, when I talked about how, you know, this might be good for Bilibili in the long run, but I don't think Wei is a better player than Shun was for BLG. I think there was a reason that Shun came back in during Worlds and that they had all of that success at that tournament, and I hate to say that I was proven right, but Shun was very good for LGD Gaming, very, very instrumental in trying to get a lot of their actual carries leads. You know, he can be inconsistent, but Wei has not clicked at all with Bilibili Gaming. In fact, it's kind of been more like negative synergy throughout 2025. It was way better last year in the regular season, but I think the problem for BLG is now that they know that this is a more permanent solution, that they don't have Shun that they can go back to, like they're starting to play a little bit different. Last year when things were working with Wei in the LPL, it was mostly because they were playing this slower paced, more methodical teamfight oriented style, kind of taking Elk and On out of their own comfort zones to allow Wei to be able to dictate tempo a bit more in the jungle matchup. But now I think On has really been vocal about wanting to speed the game back up to get Elk and On back into better spots in the bot lane, and Wei is just not a particularly good jungler at that style of play, and it's really caused some friction between this team. If Wei and On, you know, especially with their reported off the rift problems, are not able to get on the same page, this team is never going to be able to reach that apex that they're looking for. They're probably not the best team in the LPL if Wei can't adapt to this more fast-paced, aggressive, like skirmish-oriented style that Bilibili kind of got known for in not only 2024, but in 2023 when they really broke out. If Wei's not able to adapt to that, I think it's going to be a bit of a problem, and I continue to see him in a worse and worse light the more he plays on BLG. That being said, I think he has the talent to be able to do that. You know, when he was in his prime on RNG, they did play a bit more of an aggressive style than what Wei played, at least last year for BLG. I still don't think it's nearly as aggressive as what Elk and On were looking for. Wei has always been much more of a teamfight-oriented jungler, but the issue that they're running into is they just got to pick something and they got to go for it. If On has to compromise and play a little bit more safe in the early game, then that's what they have to do. If Wei's got to play a lot more aggressive in the jungle, then that's what they have to do. Whatever it is, it's got to be like cohesive amongst the team, because right now their only issue is that it doesn't feel like all of the players are on the same page. There is enough talent on this team to win the world championships. That is not up for debate, to even be like a world's favorite if everything goes right, but it's all going to be about whether or not the synergy ends up coming through. Right now, I imagine that they're going to figure something out, and, you know, I'm kind of putting my faith into them in that regard, putting them at number 1 in my power rankings, but if it doesn't happen, that's going to be the reason why. But now moving on from Group A to Group B, we're going to do the process all over again now for Group B, and that means going to the team that I think will get 4th place. Will be going down to Group Nirvana, and that for me, again, pretty obviously is going to be Ultra Prime. I hate to kind of burst everybody's bubble, but these groups are not particularly difficult to rank in terms of my expectations. I do think all 4 of the 4 best teams were distributed amongst each group equally, and unfortunately, the bottom 4 teams in particular feel very clear, and Ultra Prime is definitely kind of a part of that at the current moment. I continue to stand by what I said going into the year, that there is a lot of upside potential for this team, but the floor is just not particularly high, and I think a lot of that has come crashing down because mid-jungle has just not been good, and if you don't have a good mid-jungle in the LPL, you're basically screwed. It's very difficult to win games, and unfortunately, that's the situation I think they are finding themselves in at the current moment. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup, of course, is looking like Jiang in the top lane, Junhao in the jungle, Saber in the mid lane, Wacko at AD carry, and Rosie Love at support. I still really like the APAC imports here, the PCS imports in Jiang and Wacko. I still think both of them are very interesting players. Jiang continues to be basically everything we wanted him to be, which is this super aggressive top laner that is going to take, you know, more greedy trades. It's going to lead to some more feast or famine moments, but his mechanical talent still is definitely prevailing in a lot of instances. The problem is that if he's the best player on your team, you're probably not going to be doing particularly well. I still think he's a really good piece to build around for the future, but, you know, coming in as the number 12 top laner, like if that's the peak of your team, that's just not a particularly good spot to find yourself in, really, at all. And then I think when it comes to Wacko in the bot lane, like, he is just your stereotypical very good AD carry for APAC and for, you know, the LCP and the PCS, and a player that comes to the LPL and it's just kind of average. Honestly, he reminds me so much of Doggo. It's actually crazy, and especially with Doggo popping off right now internationally at first stand, I think a lot of people forget just how mediocre to below average Doggo was in the LPL for basically his entire tenure, especially the back half. Wacko really does remind me a lot of that, where you can tell there is talent there, but because there isn't talent surrounding him, and especially because his support isn't particularly good, it's just going to be really difficult for him to have any sort of big productive games or a long productive season or a split ahead of him. So I like Jiang, I like Wacko, I do think they're the best players on this team, but there's only so much they can do, especially Jiang, who I think is definitely trying on the top side, because the rest of this roster has just not been consistent. Rosie Love is your, you know, stereotypical, like, not great support, like slightly below average support. He's not a disaster, and honestly, in a different circumstance, could I be higher on him? Maybe, but like in comparison to some of the other like supports that have been called up from the LDL in recent years that didn't have a ridiculous amount of hype, players like Jway, players like Nickit, that kind of fit that category as well. I think Rosie Love is definitely worse than those two as not only a prospect, but in terms of what we've seen so far in the LPL. Again, very small sample size, just 3 best of 5s for a team that went out before the playoffs, but I'm not sure if I'm expecting him to be anything better than like number 13 or 14 in terms of supports throughout this split, and I think that is something that also holds Wacko back from having a really good 2v2 down in the bot lane. And then, like we already kind of spoke about, this mid lane 2v2 is just, or this mid jungle is just not good. Saber's okay. He has some interesting moments. I don't think he's like a disaster of a player. I think mid lane's pretty good in the LPL right now, so it's difficult if you are like a significantly below average player to be anything above like number 14 or number 15, but I think there is upside there. Like there is some talent, there's some mechanical skill. They really liked him. He was an internal promotion alongside Rosie Love, and so clearly whatever coaching staff is here like values having him on the roster, and he was like one of the first offseason decisions. Like he is a player that I'm interested to see moving forward, but I don't think is a star right now by any means, especially again with the rest of this team. And Junhao was one of the worst players in the entirety of the LPL in the winter split. I was super unimpressed with Junhao. Again, another player who had a little bit of hype coming out of BLG's system and played for a while in the LDL and just didn't really seem to have it in the LPL. We see players like this all the time get call-ups and just not really be able to make it work from moment one. I think Junhao might be the version of that this year. If they're going to have the worst jungler in the LPL, if they're going to have a mid laner who is definitely significantly below average and really is not going to consistently be able to compete with a lot of even the more average and more like, not high upside, but like consistent mid laners, players like Angel and players like Care, if you're going to have a mid laner who's losing to those players more regularly, like with a bad jungler, that's a problem. A support that I don't think has a ridiculously high upside, an AD carry that I'm honestly not sure has a ridiculously high upside. I think his floor is okay. I think in the right circumstance, he could perform well. I think something like an iBoy over the past couple of years, like the end of his career, where like in the right circumstance, you could see him win games, but I just don't think he's a great player. It all comes together to say that even though I really like top lane, I really like Jiang for this team, and I think he could be a really interesting top laner, it just doesn't really end up, coming into a good team. And that's where they come in at number 14 in my power rankings. At least in terms of my power rankings, they do avoid a bottom 2 spot. They are not number 15 or number 16, and so at least in terms of expectations, I would imagine that this team is able to survive the spring split, but I don't think they are guaranteed to do so. If this team loses one series that they're not supposed to, one game that they're not supposed to, that could be the end of the year for them. I don't think there's a lot of room for error, and I'm really not expecting a big breakout for many of these players or this team in 2025. But then moving on to the team that I think will get third here in Group B, and this team honestly surprised me in a good way in the winter split. I'm hoping they can carry some of that momentum over. It's Royal Never Give Up. It's RNG. I did not feel good about this roster going into the year. I had them as like, I think I had them number 12 in my power rankings going into the year, but they are definitely better than that in terms of what we've seen on the Rift. Add on to that the fact that I think they are upgrading in the support position, even if it doesn't necessarily reflect here in the rankings, which I'll talk about. I think this team could be like a sneaky contender for a team that finishes third in their group and actually does win enough series to get into Group Ascend. I certainly don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, mostly because I think that there were a couple of players that just played above my expectations, and you still have a couple of really talented players that hopefully can really start to kind of drive their points in and, really start to, I guess, make their team better immediately, because even if you have talent, you still got to go out there and win, which this team hasn't necessarily proven that they can do just yet. But let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Xiaoshu in the top lane, Milky Way in the jungle, Tong Yuan in the mid lane, Jiechi in the AD carry role, and now Nickit in the support position. We were talking about Nickit before on Ultra Prime when we were talking about supports that came up without a ton of fanfare but actually performed kind of interestingly well. Nickit was a big part of that. He was actually pretty good in summer of 2024. Now, his performances basically died the longer that split ended up going. He was like a huge shock, like positive performer, one of the more interesting supports in the entire league at the beginning of summer, and then things kind of got worse and worse and worse as the team generally got figured out. But he absolutely should have had a team coming into 2025, and I think it was pretty ridiculous that he didn't. Obviously, it felt like RNG was always going to be the obvious place to pick him up. That was kind of the rumor all offseason. For some reason, they waited until the beginning of spring to actually put him onto the team, but I think it could end up working out for them, because I do think they actually developed some interesting interesting, I guess, chemistry, like, link-ups in the winter split. I think the way that they played was actually really intriguing, and they showed that they're a lot more versatile than maybe I was anticipating going into the year, because the obvious thing to think when you looked at this RNG roster at the beginning of the year was it's going to have to be Milky Way 1v9ing and then everybody else just hoping they can hop onto the bandwagon. Milky Way is obviously a very talented, very, very good player. The problem, and I think the issue for RNG, is that Milky Way is not a very flexible player. He's not a very versatile player. He is a carry. He is going to play carries. He is going to play for himself in the early game, and if he gets himself ahead, he's going to be able to 1v9 and carry a lot of games, and if he doesn't, they're probably going to lose the game. At least that's how he was on FPX, and that was the reason that that team got really figured out in the playoffs as that year continued to go along. Why they really struggled in the playoffs, because teams could just put all of their resources into stopping Milky Way, and nobody else on that team was going to be able to beat you because they weren't really set up to do that, regardless of the kind of talent that was on the rest of that team. It's kind of similar here for RNG, but the reason I'm so encouraged is because Milky Way has been open, at least a little bit more than he was last year, to playing facilitators, to playing Maokai and Sejuani. He's really not been great on them. It doesn't look like he's ever going to be a particularly good facilitator player. The player I've always compared Milky Way to, for maybe Western fans that are kind of tuning in, is Bo. If you are a longtime LEC fan or an LEC fan from the past couple of years, you know who Bo is as a player. That's basically who Milky Way is as a player. Incredibly mechanically talented, who is just going to make some mistakes and is not particularly flexible. That's where I think the problems come in. But again, at least he's trying to play more facilitative, and I think that there were games throughout this past winter split where others were doing well. Jiachi had a really good series in Group D previously in the winter split. Tong Yuan had a really good first series in Group D. Like, there were some moments where things were looking like it could be, a little bit more of a team effort from RNG. The issue is going to be the consistency. I don't think either of those players have a ridiculously high, skill ceiling. Tong Yuan in particular is somebody who I've really pushed back on for quite a long time now. I had him as my number 16 mid laner coming into the year, the worst mid laner in the LPL. He clearly wasn't that in winter, although he's still not all that far off. He's just kind of a significantly below average mid laner instead of being somebody who's, not deserving of a spot in the LPL. I can see you running it back after what he did in winter. And Jiachi, while I think he's a good floor player, I think he has, a high floor, his ceiling is just not there. His mechanical prowess is just not ridiculously high. I think he's going to be a smart AD carry that doesn't make mistakes, but he's probably not going to be able to carry you in a lot of games. That's where the other two members come in. Xiaoshu, obviously, on the top side, really needs to take that leap. We have been waiting and asking for him to take that next big leap for years now because he showed so much as a rookie, and it feels like it's never really progressed beyond that. It's never really gotten better. He's still going to be sitting as my number 10 top laner because top lane's just not particularly deep in the LPL, but, he does not play like a top 10 player in his role all the time. He was honestly pretty disappointing in winter in terms of his individual lane results and just his impact on games in general. If he actually does end up breaking out like he's supposed to have broken out the past couple of years, then I could see a world where this all gets better, where Jiachi being a little bit more of a consistent AD carry and Tong Yuan maybe not being the strongest mid laner in the world, but someone that is, capable of showing up in a game where you can play through Xiaoshu on the top side of the map. Milky Way can get a lot of resources, and then you can have Nickit, who is a big playmaker in the support position, really facilitating that playstyle. I could see that working out for RNG, but a lot of that comes down to Xiaoshu. And of course, a lot of that comes down to Nickit. He's going to have to play more like he did at the beginning of summer than like he did at the end of summer, because truly they were two identically different players. He was not very good bottom 3 or bottom 4 support in the entire league if you just look at the Group Nirvana version of him in the back half of the year, but when you're looking at that Group D version of Nickit in the group stage from summer, he was incredibly good and almost got that team to Group Ascend. And so if you can get that version of him, and if that version's playing alongside Milky Way as a playmaker and potentially playing around Tong Yuan as a playmaker, things become a lot more interesting for this team just in general. I certainly think he has significantly more upside than a player like Lele, who he is replacing. I think that this will be a better bot lane at the very least, in the short term. The way that this is working, because other supports have moved up, I've highlighted other players that maybe were lower ranked in the winter. This ends up being an equals grade, but Nickit is a better player than Lele. This is an upgrade in the support position. I just think that supports, again, around the league, some have moved up, and so Nickit moving up a little bit isn't going to cause a huge wave, but this bot lane, if they're going to be stable and fine enough, if you can play around jungle, and if top lane finally does break out, there's a world where RNG is a top 6 or 7 team in the LPL. That being said, the more realistic outcome here is that they're going to be able to win games against teams that don't have the mechanical talent to be able to go up against Milky Way or Nickit or Jiachi or players like that. They just don't have the floor to be able to beat them, and then they're probably going to lose against the actual good teams. Think a slightly worse version of what FunPlus Phoenix was last year in 2024. I think that's the most realistic outcome for RNG. That being said, there are enough bad teams in the LPL where that could get you 8th or 9th. Like, that's pretty realistic that you could be in Group Ascend, and in fact, I do have them in the top 10 in terms of my power rankings, but it's just difficult for me to imagine that they ever have a higher upside than that unless something drastic changes. But then we get to move on to the team that I think will get second in Group B, and it's the big breakout team so far of 2025. It's Thunder Talk Gaming. I have them coming in at number 8 in my power rankings. That's 6 spots above where I had them in the preseason because I did not trust what I saw at Demacia Cup. Obviously, I was very wrong about that. I'm very happy to accept that I was wrong about that. I did not see this team on paper performing the way that they did and really doing it in the across-the-board positive way that they did, and obviously we'll talk about it with each of the individual players. I think there is some natural room for regression. This is not a top 4 or 5 team in the LPL. That's just not going to happen. I think they ended up finishing in 5th, 6th in terms of what happened in the spring split, or in the winter split. That's just not going to happen in spring here. They're not a top 5, top 6 team, at least in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. Again, maybe these players continuously get better, and maybe there's a lot to still like, but let's go ahead and go over how they ended up surprising, what I think is translatable in the spring split, and where I think that ends up putting them as a team in comparison to the rest of the league. Their lineup is looking like Hoya in the top lane, Beishwan in the jungle, Saytab in the mid lane, 1xN at AD carry, and Feather at support. You are not going to see pluses like this in terms of changes throughout the rest of this video. This is certainly the team that has changed the most in a positive direction from the start of the year to now, and how can you not be excited about that? This is a team basically full of players that nobody was really rating that highly. Really, the only one that was getting any sort of press at the beginning of the year was 1xN, and even me, like, I'd been pushing back on 1xN hype for a little while. I think he's a good player. I'm not entirely sold that he's a great player just yet. We'll talk about it. Like, this number 9 ranking is going to come in, and some people are going to be like, that's still incredibly disrespectful, but you have to remember, he's coming in just below players that I think are, like, borderline all-pro caliber. I'll spoil it a little bit. The player he's coming in just below is Leave on Ninjas in Pyjamas, who just won an all-pro, in the winter split, at least in terms of what the broadcast ended up giving out, even if I think that that was absolutely ridiculous. So I certainly don't think all that lowly of 1xN. This guy is still a really good player, and he is the best player on this team, at least in terms of what I would consider the grading scale to be, but he's certainly not the only player that ended up playing well. Him and Feather as a duo are a big reason why that bot lane ended up looking as good as it did. I was so impressed by the plays that Feather was making. Like, him and 1xN, going into the year, I thought that 1xN was a much better player than Feather, and that Feather would be the one to hold this bot lane back. That was not the case. Both of them, I think, were really effective, and I think they are an average to slightly above average LPL bot lane no matter what. Like, in the 2v2, in the team fighting stage of the game, you can basically look up and down. Like, they're a slightly above average bot lane in both of those categories, and that's just not what I was expecting from these two players. So that's kind of step 1 in why this team ended up performing as well as they did in the winter split. But really, this team's most productive player, and certainly the player that I think was influencing the most amount of games, was Beishwan in the jungle. And, I'm certainly not going to miss an opportunity to hype up Beishwan. If you followed this channel for a very long time, I've kind of gone full circle on him as a player. When we first started doing these, weekly recaps and, talking about the LPL every single week on this channel back in 2022, I was all in on Beishwan. He was incredibly smart with the way that he utilized resources. He didn't have very good mechanics. He wasn't a particularly aggressive player, but he was so good at being able to control the map and getting his laners into a good spot that he ended up being one of the more productive junglers in the entire league that year. Then Thunder Talk obviously makes the playoffs for the first time ever. He's a big reason why they end up doing that. He completely falls out of favor with Reddit, and Reddit's starting to criticize him, and I'm having to push back and say, no, this guy's actually a really good player. And then 2024, last year, comes around, and he is awful, especially in spring. He is the worst player in the LPL, or at least in conversation for being the worst player in the LPL in spring, and I can't defend that. I can't sit there and go, oh, Beishwan definitely deserves his spot back, but he gets it back for the summer split, and you know what? He's a little bit better. Him and UCal start to develop a better chemistry together, and things start to come together a bit more for him as a total package, as a jungler, and then he's retained going into 2025. I'm mega critical of Thunder Talk barely making any changes, really just, swapping out UCal for a worse mid laner, which is still the case, by the way. We'll talk about Saytab, but, I wasn't really, super enthused about Beishwan going into this year, and lo and behold, he was, genuinely one of the best junglers in the LPL in the winter split. It was actually absurd just how well he was doing, how effortlessly he was controlling games, especially in terms of tempo, completely out-jungling players like Wei in their matchups. It was just actually unfair to watch him be as good as he was, and hopefully hopefully he's going to be able to keep that up. Right now, he's moving all the way up to number 7 in terms of my jungle rankings. Again, not every position is created equally. I do think 1xN is the most valuable player on this team, but, you know, there's less great junglers than there are great AD carries in the league, and that just means that these numbers are a little bit lopsided in that regard. But Beishwan is a good player and was arguably the biggest reason why this team was so successful in winter, even if 1xN is the best player, if that makes sense. Hoya randomly turned the clock back to 2023, where he was actually good. He was pretty awful in 2024, and, you know, he was really good once again in 2025. Maybe, you know, he's going to be able to pick his form back up. His laning was actually really good for this team, so we'll see if that's going to be able to last. And then there's Satab in the mid lane. He's the one player that I'm still the most concerned about. He was pretty good in the group stage, but he got slaughtered, and I mean like absolutely slaughtered in the playoffs. He looked like a player that shouldn't have even been in the vicinity of a playoff series against a lot of these other players, and honestly, there's no reason to believe that's not who Satab is. They brought him in from DRX because nobody in Korea really wanted him after such a bad year last year. Obviously, there were good moments, and that's why he is at number 12. It's why he's moving up in these rankings at all, but he's certainly not a player that I can consider a top 10 mid laner, considering the track record. Like, I just don't believe in Satab in that kind of way, and I think if this team is going to naturally regress, it's because, like, I don't know if Hoya is going to be able to play like that again. I certainly don't think Satab is going to have a split like that again. Is Beishwan going to be able to continue to play at that level? I feel pretty good about 1xN and Feather. They're probably the lane here that has the highest floor in terms of what their output could be, but like, everything kind of has to go right for Thunder Talk to be a top 8 team. That being said, they're kind of graded out in a more fair way here, and they still come out to be number 8 in my power rankings. Could this team end up getting 3rd behind RNG? I guess it's possible. I would be significantly more surprised if they got 1st once again in their group, but is this a Group Ascend team? Yeah, like, this is a Group Ascend team. I just don't think that they're going to be able to compete for top 5 or top 6 like some people kind of wanted them to. We saw what the broadcast was doing in the playoffs, picking them to beat JD Gaming and, you know, go to winners finals. At the time, I called that out and talked about how ridiculous it was. Obviously, that has aged well, but I think my thoughts on Thunder Talk continue to be pretty balanced and pretty neutral. This is a good team that is going to be competing for top, you know, 7 or top 8, but probably isn't going to be a team that's actually competing to go far in terms of the playoffs. But then moving on to the number 1 team in Group B, and this one should be incredibly obvious to everybody. If you're not buying into the hype train, buy into it now. It's anyone's Legend coming in at number 1 for me. Not at number 1 in the power rankings, but number 3 in the power rankings. This is bare minimum a top 3 team in the LPL. I honestly think you could put them higher if you really wanted to. I have faith in Bilibili Gaming, as we've seen, and you can probably guess who's number 2 in my power rankings, but I just can't reasonably put AL below number 3. I really do think that they are that good of a team, and they are that complete of a team. It's everybody right now that has really been able to step up, which is why we can really start talking about them as a team to watch out for the rest of the year, and why I think they will be making some international appearances in 2025 for the first time in this organization's history. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Flandre in the top lane, Tarzan in the jungle, Shanks in the mid lane, Hope at AD carry, and Kale at support. A couple of players on this team are big time channel darlings, and so I really have to like hold myself in and make sure I don't go too far in that direction. My favorite player in the world is probably on my favorite LPL organization that I've defended and gone to bat for over and over again, but man, has he made it worthwhile. Tarzan just continues to look utterly ridiculous everywhere that he goes. It's absurd that LPL fans, maybe not as much anymore, but at one point in time were just so out on this guy that they were willing to let him be teamless for an entire split like he was in spring of last year. This dude is the best jungler in the LPL. He's number 1. He's getting that number 1 grade. To me, it's not even up for debate anymore. Tarzan is the best jungler in the LPL. He has made a definitive statement to be considered for best jungler in the world, and honestly, he might be the best jungler in the world. Like, him versus Peanut right now, I think is a lot closer than people want to say it is. And honestly, would I take Tarzan? I kind of would at the current moment. In terms of just what he has been as a player, it's so ridiculously consistent. He is so good at his style of playing. He can branch out. He is flexible if he needs to be. He can carry if he really has to. But what he does that is so difficult to stop, and quite frankly, if you can do this at a high level, it's basically impossible to stop, is he plays these facilitative types of champions like Sejuani, like Maokai, you know, even things like Vi that aren't necessarily considered to be primary options, and he plays them so aggressive and skirmish heavy in the early game that other teams just can't compete. He is so much better as a skirmisher than basically everybody else in the world in terms of jungle matchups that there is nobody that's going to be able to compete, and he's picking champions that scale super effortlessly into the late game and can be like free frontline, free CC. Like, it's actually ridiculous how consistently he's able to dominate games on this strategy. And again, he is is flexible. He can play Xin Zhao and just be a little bit more aggressive. He can play Maokai a little bit more passively if you need him to do that. It's just that one style, like the style of playing aggressive on these more facilitative champions, that's unstoppable when he plays it well, and that's why Tarzan is coming in as the #1 jungler in the world. I just don't think you can possibly look at it in any other way right now. I mean, obviously in the world maybe you can, but he is the #1 jungler in the LPL, and to me that's pretty non-debatable at this point. He comes in above Tion and Kanavi. I think he is better than them. The other player that you have to talk about being a standout in the winter split was Flandre. Like, oh my god, what a re-emergence for Flandre. In terms of production, was he the best top laner in the LPL in winter? Like, maybe. It certainly is up there. Like, he obviously wasn't perfect in the finals against 369. I think that there are some reasonable criticisms to throw his way, but he has been nothing but an upgrade to Ale here for what AL kind of had wanted out of him. And again, he can play carries, he can play tanks if he really needs to. He's definitely much more of a lane-dominant player naturally, as we've always known him, but like, this is prime Flandre coming back into the LPL. That feels like this team has really reinvigorated his desire to like try and to play at a really high level, and that is gigantic. Hope and Kale were unreal good, certainly the most consistent bot lane in the LPL over the last split, even if they don't have the highest highs. Like, Hope has really impressed me. His ability to carry games and be a primary option was just not something I thought was going to happen for him in his career, and yet here he is doing that. You know, Kale has been a player that I have pounded the table for basically since the start of this channel. I was really going to bat for him in 2022 when he was on Sandbox, and obviously things kind of fell apart for that team in 2023. Comes over to the LPL last year and is really good. This could be the breakout year where he's starting to like really emerge as one of the best supports in the world. I've been expecting this for a little while. I'm glad to see that my hype in him has paid off over the years. And then there's Shanks in the mid lane, and you know, as much shit as I talk about Shanks, where I'm like, man, he's so ridiculously good. If he could play the way that he plays at the beginning of the year, all year long, and throughout every single game, then he'd be the best mid laner in the world. Like, as much as I still do believe that the inconsistency is naturally there, we saw a mostly good version of Shanks. The fall off didn't really happen. Typically speaking, what we see is him play really well at the beginning of the split, and then as we get more and more games, he progressively starts to play worse. It's happened basically every split of his entire career. It didn't happen in winter. He made finals because of it. And this was a finals team. You have to remember that. They only lost in the finals to a team that they had already beaten twice earlier in that year, including in the group stage of that exact split. And so, is there a reasonable, like, take to say that this is the #1 team in the LPL? Yeah, I think there is a way that you could spin that narrative and say that this is the best team and the favorite in the LPL right now. I'm not going to make that statement. I think it's a little bit far out there for me at the current moment. I still need to see a bit more continuous success, but they are certainly on their way. And if you have players like Tarzan and Hope and Flandre in particular playing the way that they did in winter, that's the best team in the LPL. So really, I'm not asking for AL to step up. I'm not asking to see the high end. We've seen the high end. We just need to see if they can stay consistent and if they can actually play like that the whole year. But now moving on to the second half of our video, and that means kicking off Group C here, and the team that I think will get last in Group C, again, a pretty obvious choice for me. It is going to be FunPlus Phoenix. This team did make a change in kind of the pseudo offseason here to try and get better, but I do think there still are a lot of things that I don't feel all that great about when it comes to FPX. I certainly feel worse about them than I did going into the year, mostly because I just think the top side of the map that was supposed to be kind of the lock steady part of this team was not nearly as good as I was hoping it would be. There are still some questions about who will be the official starters for this team moving forward, but for now, this looks like it's going to be the starting five, and, you know, even if this team does have quite a bit of experience, I think that there is, like, a real lack of, like, upside in terms of what could happen unless one of these players re-breaks out. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Sheer in the top lane. I believe it's going to be Shadow in the jungle, Care in the mid lane, Assume at AD carry, and Jway at support. Of course, the only caveat here in terms of who could potentially be starting for this team is that Shadow didn't play for most of the winter split. It was actually Sorrow in the jungle that played for this team, and obviously Shadow ended up coming in at the end of the group stage for them. I think Shadow is going to be the full-time starter from this time moving forward, and maybe that does just make this team play better. I think that there is a pretty reasonable assumption there that that could be the case. Assumption, assume, pun intended entirely, but if Shadow is in, I do think that gives them a higher upside because I do think we've seen Shadow actually perform at a really high level here before. Sorrow's an interesting player, but certainly not one that I think is like guaranteed to be good. And I think especially because you are making moves to try to be better now by bringing in a player like Assume, you are likely trying to just start the best possible 5. And again, all of these players have had at least some level of experience and at least some level of success at this level, of course, to varying degrees. You have players like Sheer who have been incredibly successful in their very short tenures. You know, a player like Shadow who's a former LEC champion and, you know, somebody who's made it pretty far in the playoffs before in the LPL. Care was really good in the playoffs last year. Assume and Jway might be the less experienced members of this team, but they certainly still have a lot. The problem is I'm just not sure if they have a lot of chemistry or if you're going to be able to get the best versions of a lot of these players. A lot of these players were second or third pieces on teams that were good before, even fourth or fifth pieces on teams that were good before, and haven't really been asked to be like number 1 or number 2 options, and that's kind of what they're going to have to be on this team. Most specifically, the one that I'm really looking for is Sheer in the top lane. You can see I'm dropping him 4 spots from the winter split. I don't think all that differently of Sheer. I still think he's a really interesting player, and obviously he's had such an interesting career arc already as such a young player where with basically no competitive experience, he's plucked out of solo queue and immediately thrown in to LGD Gaming last year, having to play with Ruler and having to play with Kanavi and, you know, getting this big opportunity to try and be a player who in his first year of competitive qualifies for Worlds, and it just doesn't end up working out. But he was not the issue on that team last year. He wasn't really the biggest problem. He certainly wasn't the solution, but I thought that there was a pretty realistic chance that he could be a Wayward-esque type of player that didn't feel all that great on a team that was trying to make Worlds, but, you know, he moves down the ladder, moves to a team that doesn't have as high of expectations and can get a little bit more resources and could actually be like a really good top laner in that regard. That wasn't really the case in Winter. He was just an average top laner, even a slightly below average top laner in terms of the results. If you're able to get a good version of Sheer out of this, like that is a big turning point to me in terms of whether or not FPX is going to be a team that actually does compete to be like third place in this group, because that's kind of what you're looking for. If you're a team that's projected to be last in a group like this, you just want to get into that third place tournament. And I think if Sheer is like a primary option for them, I think that will help. Of course, the addition of Assume in the bot lane also could really move you in that direction, because I do think Assume could be a primary carry option for this team. I've never been ridiculously high on him. I've lumped him into that cluster of like, you know, I have him right below 1xN and I have him right around Leave and, you know, all of these players that have good upside, but I just don't know exactly if they're going to be able to reach that on any individual like game-to-game basis. You definitely don't know if from a consistency standpoint they're going to be able to be a number 1 option for a playoff team for an extended period of time. I certainly have more question marks about Assume than I do about players like 1xN or Leave, who have, you know, shown at least at a higher level that they have higher upside in my opinion than a player like Assume, but he is an upgrade to Bat. That is not really all that up for debate. Bat was really bad for this team in Winter. He was one of the weaker AD carries, I would say, in the entire league, and Assume coming in I think is going to add some level of stability. If Sheer and Assume especially can be like a really dangerous side lane duo for this team and can generate leads on their own, at least against the bad teams, that's really gonna be what makes or breaks FunPlus Phoenix's rest of the year, because I do like the addition of Assume. I think he is gonna come in and make this team better, at least from a floor perspective, but how much better is really gonna be the question. It's not really about, oh, Assume is better than Bat, that means FPX is better. It's how many teams do you now beat because Assume is in the bot lane, and I think part of this is gonna come down to Jway. Jway, I have one spot right above Nickit. I think they're very similar players. We already, of course, talked about him in the RNG section, but basically everything I said about Nickit, you could say about Jway, where the highs have looked really good, and I think the upside is absolutely there for him to be an average support, like, right now at this level, and a potentially, like, above average support moving forward. The problem is the lows are also very clear, and the inconsistency is just a little bit staggering. He has a much better AD carry to play off of in the 2v2 now, going into spring, which I think is definitely going to make things a little bit easier for him, but at the end of the day, if this bot lane is below average, like FPX is still going to be a bottom 4 team in the league, and they're still going to get last place. This bot lane matters a lot. Now, again, another full split of introducing a new jungler could be a positive. Shadow came in and was bad down the stretch, but he also probably didn't have a ton of time to scrim with the rest of this team. It felt like they really wanted to try and give Sorrow like a real shot in the jungle, and Sorrow wasn't awful, but he wasn't good either. Shadow was miserably bad in the one series that he did end up playing in the regular season at the end of the group stage in Winter. If you give him more time, maybe he has better chemistry with players like Care and Sheer. He has to be better than what he was in his very limited sample size in Winter, because that was awful, but I've always liked Shadow a lot as a player. I think he can be a very valuable piece because he is pretty flexible and he does have good mechanics. He's a decently smart player. Like, it's reasonable to expect him to be a top 7 or a top 8 jungler. I don't think that's really out of the realm of possibility, and if he can get there, again, this team is going to be better than number 13. Care is what he is at this point. Like, he's gonna perform sometimes and he's not gonna perform other times. He's just a very finicky player. I'm not all in on Care or anything like that. I think he's probably at the bottom of the mid laners that I think have established themselves as LPL mid laners. Like, he is above the players that are a lot more fringy in terms of whether or not they should have LPL spots. You know, we've talked about players like that already in this video. Basically, anybody below him is like, oh, you know, Saber hasn't really, you know, locked in his spot in the LPL. Someone like Tong Yuan hasn't always looked all that good. Someone like Karis has been bad at multiple levels. Like, he's definitely better than those players, but like, if you compare him to a lot of the other long-standing LPL mids that have also had some ups and downs, you know, even a player like Angel that we talked about earlier on in the video, like, Care is, like, pretty clearly worse than those players. So it just ends up coming into a situation where you have to hope you roll well on Care, and to me, you gotta hope that Sheer, Shadow, Assume, and Jway are just good enough where Care, if he's the 5th best player on this team, that's kind of where you want to land if you're FPX, and honestly, that's good enough to be top 10. Like, that version of the team, if Sheer steps up and is, you know, as good as he was at times last year for JD Gaming, if Assume and Jway can be a lot better of a bot lane and can actually be like a league average bot lane, Shadow's a good facilitator, and Care is just not actively losing you games in the middle of the map, like, yeah, that's a top 10 team, and that's where I had them in the preseason. I still think it is possible for them to be around that level, but a lot of those things have to go right, and honestly, role player teams don't do all that well in the LPL, so we'll have to see, but at least for now, definitely after winter, erring more on the side of negativity than positivity. But then moving on now to the team I think will get third in this group, and it is going to be, oh my god, you probably could have expected that after seeing FPX at the bottom. They're going to stay at number 11 in terms of my power rankings. I'm still not super sold on this team, and quite frankly, I think if I had to like sum them up and talk about what the pieces together actually end up indicating for me, this is one of the more difficult teams to evaluate holistically, because I think the good players are really good and really interesting, and I could see a big breakout for some of them, but the bad players, like the weak links on this team, I think are some of the weakest links in the entire league, and so it ends up kind of counterbalancing itself out in those instances, and we can talk about that. I'm sure a lot of people have pretty similar thoughts and opinions on that, so let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Harry in the top lane, Hang in the jungle, Lin Feng in the mid lane, Starry at AD carry, and Moham at support. We can start with the good, because I think there is a lot of good on this team. First and foremost, I really am in on Starry. I know it doesn't feel like that from the rating that I'm giving him here. He's going down 3 spots to number 11 from what he was in my preseason rankings, but I feel basically the exact same way about Starry that I did in the preseason. I just think that there are more good AD carries. You had players like 1xN that shot up my rankings, players like Leave that shot up my rankings after winter, and a player like On who was reintroduced to the league, and unfortunately that means even if I feel the same about Starry, he's naturally just going to go down because I think the AD carry role got better, at least in terms of expectation going into spring, but I still feel really good about him being a potential breakout star. I have him just below a player like Assume because I do think his floor is like a tad bit lower than Assume's. I think Assume is maybe a bit of a better player at the current moment, but it's certainly not by a lot. I think if Starry were to like complete his arc and like really start to fill his potential and live up to what I think he could become, I have him as a better rated prospect in terms of potential than like 1xN and like Assume and, you know, all of these players that people hype up. I think his mechanics are absolutely ridiculous. I just don't think he necessarily has the support around him in order to get that out of him right now, but this guy's really good. Like, I'm bought in on Starry. I'm certainly not trying to make the case that I think that Starry is undervalued or anything like that. I think people understand that he's a really good prospect, but to me, he's like a great prospect. I like him a lot more as a prospect than I liked 1xN or Assume, and, you know, those players are good. I just think he could be a top 5 guy, and you pair him up with someone like Moham in the support position who, while he's not a star, is like the definition of a good, not great player, and that's fine. Like, that's a bot lane that can absolutely function and work at the LPL level, especially for a team that wants to fight it out to be a top 2 team in their group. Like, we're going to cover bot lanes that could be top 2 in their group that are just worse than Starry and Moham, and I think that that is something that really plays into why I like OMG. Now, Moham is a very one-dimensional player. He's going to play Engagers or he's not going to do anything. Like, he cannot play Enchanters. He cannot play, you know, roaming playmakers. He wants to play Rel. He wants to play Nautilus. He wants to play Leona. If he doesn't get those champions, he is a significantly worse player, and so you definitely don't feel like the most flexible with Moham in the support position, but at the end of the day, he plays those champions really well. He went to Worlds last year with D plus Kia for a reason. He is a solid player, and I think Starry, with with that like super high upside, really good potential. Like this could be a really good bot lane. And I really like Lin Feng in the mid lane. I think Lin Feng is a pretty solid player. I was really impressed with what we saw out of him in winter. I thought his tape was really good. Wasn't exactly sure what we were going to get out of Lin Feng in 2025, because while I thought his tape was okay, I didn't know if the rest of the team around him was going to be able to facilitate him having like an actually good year. Turns out he is just like a good mid laner, not a star, at least certainly not a star yet, but definitely somebody that I'm intrigued by at the LPL level. There are a lot of good mid laners, and he is certainly like a league average mid laner if you want to kind of put him into there, and I think he could grow higher. Again, if you're looking at Lin Feng and Starry as like a potential duo of the future for OMG in the same way that they had for many years with, you know, Cream and Shanji in the top lane, and then Abel in the AD carry role, like building around Aki in the jungle, building around a lot of these young players, I think Lin Feng and Starry could kind of be that young core that OMG is building around for the next generation, because I think they're both really interesting players. The problem is the top side of the map is just an absolute disaster for OMG. It's actively one of, if not the worst in the entire league. Harry, to me, is the worst top laner in the LPL. I actually moved him below Cube, and that's a pretty big indictment, I would say, on Harry as a whole, because, you know, Cube is not a very good player, but Harry is just not good. Like, there's nothing else I need to see. I've always been out on Harry. I was pushing back on the hype that he was getting as a rookie, certainly pushing back on the hype he was getting once he signed to Anyone's Legend and then OMG last year. It just feels like he's always been put in these positions where people are expecting him to be a better player than he actually is. He's not a good top laner. He's the worst in the LPL as of right now, and I really don't expect that to change. I would be shocked if at any point he had like a re-breakout on the top side. I think he's just somebody who's going to lose over and over again. And I think you could say similar things for Hang in the jungle, who, if Junhao for Ultra Prime didn't exist, would be a pretty easy choice for number 16 in terms of, you know, jungle rankings. He's going to be number 15. He's just not an LPL caliber jungler. He's lost all of his confidence. He's lost all of his ability to play around mid-game pressure. And again, like we talked about Moham being a one-dimensional player, but at least he's really good at that one dimension. Hang is a one-dimensional player, and that his early games are okay and pretty solid, but he cannot play like the mid or late game. Like, he is only really good pre 8 minutes into the game. The problem is, if he loses at any point in those pre 8 minutes, or if he has a bad matchup or anything like that, like, there is just no way to salvage the game for him. He has no way to play around that in any other way. So I'm pretty out on Hang. Now, one thing I will say, there is a little bit of Beixuan in Hang's game, or at least in terms of the negatives of Hang's game. There are definitely some similarities, I think, in how they ended up playing things out. I think Hang definitely relies a lot more on his mechanics than Beixuan does. Beixuan was always a bit of a smarter player, and I think, you know, had some interesting pieces there, but jungle is a hard position to play in the LPL when your team is losing. I think that there is a chance where now all of a sudden your bot lane gets better, and maybe mid lane is like pretty solid here for this team, and Hang could actually have some better performances. I'm not entirely ruling that out, because I have seen some interesting things on tape from him in the past when he was on WE. The problem is, it's just not been recent. His recent tape with WE was a disaster. It's why he got replaced at the end of last year, and it's been significantly worse even to start 2025. So that's really the rundown for OMG. It's very difficult to predict where exactly this team is going to land, because I like their good players. I really like Starry. I think Moham's fine. I think Lin Feng could be a good player, but they're bad players. Harry, Hang, like, they're weak links. Again, some of the weakest in the entire league. It's difficult to get a real read on where they could land. They could be the number 4 team in this group, go down to Group Nirvana, and who knows, maybe like they did last split, they could absolutely tank in the actual group stage, end up going down to Group Nirvana, and then play really well there. Or this could be a team that randomly starts to compete for top 2 because Harry is able to survive enough on the top side in a ZDZ kind of way, and Hang actually is able to get some confidence back by playing with players like Lin Feng, Starry, and Moham who are doing a lot of the carrying. Like, it's totally possible that either of those outcomes end up happening. I'm going to equalize it out somewhere around 11 here. I think they'll be better than the bad teams. I think they'll allow players like Lin Feng and Starry to be able to, like, beat them, but I just don't think they have the consistency or the firepower to beat actual good teams, which to me is why I don't really expect them to be near the top 10, why I don't think this team is going to be competing. Even a team like FPX in this group probably has a higher upside than OMG, just because I'm really scared of this top side, but at least for now they have a higher floor because of their players, and so they're going to come in at number 3 in the group for me. Then moving on to our second place team in Group C here, and again, this one was pretty obvious to me. I didn't have to think about this one all that much. I kind of knew basically where I wanted to put this team, and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on where they'll be for the rest of the year. It's Ninjas in Pyjamas coming in at number 7 in my power rankings. Again, some people might think that this number is too low, considering what they were in the regular season, considering, spoiler alert, they are 1 spot below the team in Invictus Gaming that they beat in the regular season, but I just don't really have the same kind of faith faith in NIP that they're going to be able to maintain that consistency. Honestly, the best way I can describe my view on NIP is that I think that they are a better and more talented version of what we just talked about with OMG, where I think the best players on this team are really good, but the consistency on this team I think is really low, and that concerns me in terms of what their upside could be moving forward. Maybe there's a world where everything starts to click for NIP and where everything starts to get together, but at least for me, my expectation of this team is that they will be fun and competitive and that they're going to be able to take some games that maybe you wouldn't expect because they have weird strategies and they have very mechanically talented players, but I doubt that they're going to be a big threat to win the LPL. And so we'll go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Shanji in the top lane, Aki in the jungle, Doanb in the mid lane, Leave at AD carry, and PP God at support. Of course, no changes here for this team. This conversation starts and basically ends with Doanb in the mid lane. First off, I really want to say it, like, he was way better than I thought he was going to be day number one coming back into the LPL. He basically was the group stage, like, regular season MVP in the winter split. He was unbelievably good. He was super valuable to the team and just to, like, their team success as a whole. He was absolutely taking over games on things like Rise, and he wasn't shy about pulling out weird picks either. Like, it very much felt like classic Doanb. It felt like prime Doanb, quite frankly. My only concern when it came to Doanb is, like, can he match up mechanically against the best mid laners in the region, like, super consistently? The only one he really had to face in his group, in Group D, in winter was Rookie, and Rookie had a super down split just in general. Rookie was not playing well by really any metric, and so Doanb, once he got into the playoffs and had to start playing against actually good mid laners and you know, like players that were actually going to be able to compete with him mechanically, like, it started to look a little bit worse. He is an incredibly smart player, and he understands exactly how he needs to be able to generate those advantages, but he just isn't always able to dominate the league in the way that you would need out of a superstar player, and that's why I think there is, like, an inherent upside cap to Doanb. He's just not the player he was in 2019, where mechanically speaking, he is good enough to be able to go up against all of the top mid laners in the world, and mentally he's, like, way ahead of all of them. He still is pretty far ahead mentally. It's just I think the mechanics are a bit worse, and that's kind of what we saw when he was towards the back end of his tenure last time in the LPL on LNG, where the mechanics just kind of weren't up to snuff. That very much came through in the playoffs, at least from my perspective, but he still is really good. He's a top 4 mid laner, a top 7 or 8 player in the LPL at, like, bare minimum. You could say that he's a top 5 player in the LPL, and I'm really not going to compete all that much with that. Like, Doanb is not the reason that this team is out of contention for winning the LPL. Doanb can be your best player, and you can win the LPL. The problem is every other player that you're relying on here is super inconsistent, maybe with the exception of PP God in the support position, I should say. PP God's obviously really good, and this is his first year back on Ninjas in Pyjamas. He does have a bit of, like, impact syndrome to him, and for those of you who don't follow the channel, impact syndrome, at least in my eyes, is every single time you move to a new organization, a new team, you play super well in year 1, and then things kind of get worse as you play in year 2 and beyond. PP God has kind of felt that over the course of his career. I think he definitely looks better year 1 on a new organization. Luckily for him, this is year 1 back in the Victory 5 Ninjas in Pyjamas, like, cycle, and I do think Leave is very similar to Photic in the way that he ends up playing, where he has this really high mechanical ceiling but just absolutely no consistency. I think Leave is a better player than Photic, obviously, which we will get into later on in the video, but PP God, I think, is good enough for you to be able to facilitate the rest of this team. Doanb and PP God, especially as a shot-calling duo, is very dangerous, and this team is always going to have pretty exceptional macro, as we saw throughout all of the season, but the problem is, as teams get better and as teams get more cohesive throughout the rest of the year, the gap between the teams that have great macro and good macro is going to get smaller. Typically, you see more of a gap at the beginning of the year when it comes to things like that, and so they're really going to need to have some of these more inconsistent and mechanically talented players be able to benefit a lot more from these, like, macro advantages that Doanb and PP God are going to be able to get. At least in winter, that was Leave in the bot lane. We know how talented Leave is. Like, mechanically speaking, he has the potential to be a top 1 or a top 2 AD carry in the LPL. I don't think anybody's really arguing that. Like, his raw ability to play out 2v2s and specifically to play out, like, mid-game skirmishes is just as good as anybody in the world. Like, he is so talented, and we know that he can take over and pop off in games. The problem is his decision-making is bottom tier. Like, he is truly a min-maxed player in terms of how he plays the AD carry role, where the maximized version is just being able to skirmish and, you know, really good positioning and, you know, just generally good mechanics. And the bottom tier is like, I'm going to step up and randomly die at least once per game. Like, it is truly frustrating. Now, some of that got reined in at least a little bit in winter here. I think, again, because he gets to play with PP God and Doanb, who are very smart players. But the problem is you can't completely take that out of Leave's game. It's always going to be something that is a bit of a problem. He is at the bare minimum a top 7 or a top 8 AD carry. But again, there are a lot of really good AD carries who who would you put him above? Would you put him above a player like, you know, Hope on anyone's Legend? Can you tell me that Leave was definitely better than Hope on AL? Can you tell me Leave is better than Light, who comes in as my number 6 AD carry? Like, On comes in at number 7 because I really like On. You can put Leave above On, and I would kind of understand that, but, like, can you, like, generally put him higher than number 7? It's really hard for me to feel comfortable saying that, considering at 20 minutes every single game, he'll make an absolutely boneheaded play that gets rid of at least some of the lead that he does such a good job at being able to generate. It just is what it is. When it comes to Leave, you have to kind of rely on that. But again, if you can rein him in and allow Doinb and PP God to be the people directing the missiles somewhere and he can just take over team fights, like that's what they did with Fodic, and that's why they were successful on Victory 5. Obviously not Doinb, it was Rookie in that role, but that's kind of what this team was in 2022, and I think you could get a similar version with Leave on this team. The only other issue I run into is that topside is also not something that I think is particularly consistent for this team. I love Shanji. I think his upside is still super high. The problem is he's gotten worse since he's come over to Ninjas in Pyjamas. He is just not OMG Shanji. He's not that same player. He is much worse in lane. Like, that is really where it stands out. He can still be a good team fighter, especially if he gets to that stage of the game with a gold lead, but the problem is, like, he was a great laner on OMG, was constantly given counter pick and was constantly put in positions where he could dominate the 1v1 and given resources in that regard. He is a below average laner on NIP. I've never really seen a top laner just completely flip like that in terms of how good or bad they are in a certain stage of the game, and that's just really affecting his output right now in the LPL. And then you have Aki, who I don't really know what to say. 2023 feels like the biggest outlier that has ever outliered for any player in the history of the LPL. He was awesome in 2023, and I get that a lot of people are going to point to the fact that Cream was good in 2023, and Shanji was excellent in 2023, and Abel and PP God had a really good time in 2023, but, like, Aki was the best player on that team, at least from my perspective. He was winning so many games. He was a top 3, top 4 jungler in the LPL in 2023. He was not that before. I was honestly pretty low on Aki before that year, and he's certainly not been that since, and so it just kind of feels like a one-year wonder thing for him because he's just not a good jungler, especially for the top of the standings, and that's another thing that holds this team back. So as much as I like Doinb, and I think that he is a really good centralizing piece to build around and a really good culture guy to give this team an identity, and I think PP God plays into that identity, and I think Leave as this, like, super mechanically talented but bad decision maker honestly does kind of play into that identity because you can have these other players point him in that direction, and even Shanji can kind of play into that as well. I think you just have too many question marks. Leave is going to make some bad plays every game, and you can't rely on him in big moments. Aki is just not a particularly good jungler for the level that this team wants to play at, and Shanji has not been a good laner in the top lane. If it's Doinb or bust on this team, that is an inherent cap, and again, it's similar to OMG in that regard. They're going to be able to beat teams that I think they can outskill or that can't take advantage of the mistakes that they make pretty regularly, but the good teams are going to be able to beat them, and we saw that in the playoffs. I expect this team to be around number 5, 6, or 7 in terms of the power rankings, somewhere there. They're top 2 team in this group. They will get into Group Ascend, but I just don't know how much noise they're going to make once they get there, and that is kind of the concern for me. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in Group C, and boy is it a topical team to talk about when it comes to the LPL. It's Top Esports coming in as my number 2 seed, my number 2 power rank team in the LPL, and of course the defending champions, the representative from the LPL at the First Stand tournament, and a team that is certainly drawing a lot of criticism right now for their performance at that tournament. It's so difficult to try to evaluate them because domestically it is so easy to project them to be a top 1 or a top 2 team. It's not even really like all that up in the air when you look at all of these players. They're super consistent basically in every single role. You don't really have any major playstyle questions and concerns, and they are coming off of a championship, which is the best that they've done domestically in many years, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't put off by the fact that they were so bad at First Stand that they only won 1 best of series at that entire tournament. They won 1 best of 3 against Team Liquid. They lost to K-Corp, they lost to CFO, they lost twice to Hanwha Life Esports, and neither of those series looked even remotely close. They went 0-5 against HLE. This team has major concerns, but at least domestically, how can you not still consider them a favorite? I get that there's going to be a lot of negative feelings and negative emotions, but I'm not ranking them for MSI. I'm not ranking them for Worlds. I'm ranking them for the LPL, and right now I just cannot put them below number 2 in my power rankings going into the LPL season, so let's go ahead and talk about why. Their lineup is still looking like 369 in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Cream in the mid lane, Jackie Love at AD carry, and Crisp at support. it's just really difficult to know where to start when it comes to this team. I honestly think by far the most important player in terms of why their form was so bad at first stand and why it was so good domestically is Kanavi in the jungle. There's really nobody else to start with because I do think he is the driving force for how this team is going to end up playing for the rest of the year. Kanavi is such an interesting player to talk about because he is so adept at getting early leads. That's always been what Kanavi is best at. He is the best early game pather ever. Like in the history of League of Legends, nobody's been able to optimize being able to generate gold leads in the way that Kanavi has been able to optimize generating gold leads. It's why he's been one of the best junglers ever, like in terms of performances. It's why he's been on some super teams and really been able to elevate a lot of people in the last 5 years in terms of the laners that he's been able to play with. Like Kanavi is the kind of player that is just so good at generating leads. The problem is what we're learning right now is a lot of the rest of the world is starting to catch up in terms of being able to play out the early game, or they've been able to identify something either in Kanavi's game or just generally in terms of early pathing that can slow the pace down. And the problem for Kanavi is he's not done a very good job at being able to adapt to that. He's going to fall to number 3. I had him as my number 1 jungler heading into the year. He goes out and wins a championship. He's a big part of why this team has a lot of domestic success in the playoffs, and I feel very good about that ranking, but I do think that there is an inherent feast or famine-ness to Kanavi that you don't get out of players like Tarzan and Tion that I have listed above him. And honestly, like, I just don't know what I'm expecting out of Kanavi at this point. I think he's going to be great domestically. I think he's still going to be very greedy. I think especially in this group where, like, look at the junglers in this group. You're going up against, like, your best competition in this group is Aki in terms of junglers. Yeah, Kanavi's a lot better than Aki. And then you've got someone like Hang on OMG. Yeah, I think Kanavi is much better than Hang. You have someone like Shadow on FPX. Like, Kanavi's much better than Shadow. Like, he is by far and away the best jungler in this group, which is why I still think he's going to perform at a ridiculously high level. But when it comes to my expectations for him in the playoffs, they're just a little bit lower than maybe they were a couple of months ago. And then you do have to start getting into the conversation of everybody else here. I have Cream jumping up a spot to number 2, which might feel crazy after his first stand performance, but somehow, some way, I feel better about Cream right now than I did at the beginning of the year, because to me, what he solidified is that he is who he was last year. It wasn't just a one-year wonder type of thing, which can sometimes happen specifically in the LPL. Cream definitely followed up last year and showed that the progress and the progression that he made was so positive. He was this team's best player in their playoff run that ended up getting them a championship domestically. I'm not saying he was the only good player. Kanavi was excellent. I thought 369 was excellent. Crisp was awesome. Jackie Love played really well in the finals. And so, like, you can definitely attribute everybody towards that success towards the back half of the split. But Cream, to me, was the most consistent. And he really had to run the gambit. I know we've talked about it forever on this channel, but he had to go through Rookie, and then through Doenby, and then through Knight, and then through Scout, and then through Shanks. He had to beat, like, the who's who of the best mid laners in LPL history, and he did it. He came out on top in basically every single one of those matchups. And to me, I just can't reasonably put him below number 2. I know people are going to call him a one-trick, but anybody who follows the channel knows that we've laughed about that for a long time. You can't be a Tristana one-trick, and an Akali one-trick, and a Sylas one-trick, and an Azir one-trick. Like, you can't have all of these and still be called a one-trick. It just doesn't operate like that. It doesn't work like that. He is much more flexible than people give him credit for, and I think he's shown that very recently. I still expect him to perform very well domestically. He only comes in at number 2 because I think Knight is that good at number 1, but he comes in above everybody else because I think that's where he's landed as a player. And you can say the same thing for 369. Talk about how he got completely outplayed by Zeus at the tournament. Talk about how he wasn't better than Rest in terms of their best of 3 against CFO. Those are all relative things, but he completely gapped Bin in the playoffs, and that has to account for something. He was arguably the best performing top laner in the entire league in winter outside of Flandre, who comes in just below him at number 3. Like, how do I not put 369 still at top 2? He's got the track record. He's a good weak side player. He's a good strong side player. He can basically do whatever you need him to do. Again, I know there's a sour taste in people's mouths, but these are good players, and Jackie Love and Crisp were honestly fine at first stand. Jackie Love maybe not as much. He's actually going to drop one spot going down to number 3 because we have a new number 1 in terms of my rankings, as we probably saw with Elk being number 2. You can probably guess who that is based on the players that have been revealed up until this point. But, you know, Jackie Love is still Jackie Love, and he's still a lot more consistent than people give him credit for because they remember 2020, 2021, 2019 Jackie Love. He's not that player anymore. He's a lot more reserved. He's a lot more, you know, willing to play within the structure and the confines of the team than be the guy who has to play hero ball. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that Top Esports is so good elsewhere. And Crisp, he's going to jump up a spot to number before, because to me, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, he was this team's best player at first stand. He was playing really well at that tournament. He had a lot of really good plays. He was looking for creative angles. He wasn't making a ridiculous amount of mistakes until the back half of that tournament when he was going up against Hanwha Life and things were getting a little bit worse. I'm fine with Crisp here. I think he's a totally good, like, championship caliber support, and when you look across the board, this is a super dangerous team still. You've basically got a top 3 player in every role. The only player that isn't top 3 in their role for me is Crisp. If you wanted him top 3, put him above Hong. I don't care. Like, him and Hong are totally interchangeable, as Weibo Gaming and Top Esports clearly learned. And so, you know, it's difficult for me to sit here and say that this team should not be considered favorites to once again try and win the LPL, because they absolutely should, especially because the way that this group ended up working out. I think that that's nothing but a positive for them. This is a very winnable and quite frankly, a very beatable group. This is the weakest group. Group C is definitely the most winnable, and I think Top Esports should be able to take advantage of that. And overall, like, I'm really expecting them to dominate here and show up into the playoffs and continue to perform domestically. Now, if they get to MSI or if they get to Worlds and, you know, that ends up being the case, we'll have a different conversation when it comes to that, because clearly there's some magic voodoo around this team's international performances. But if I'm giving you rankings for a domestic performance, whether or not I think this team is going to do well domestically, it's basically impossible for me to put this team below number 2 in those domestic rankings. That's going to bring us to our final group of the video and our last 4 teams that we get to cover, and that is, of course, Group D. So let's go ahead and jump into it. The team that I expect to get last place in Group D, again, pretty self-explanatory, is going to be LGD Gaming. I don't really have high expectations for this roster or for this team. I don't have, like, crazy low expectations. I think that there is a world where they're relevant, but I think they got super lucky in winter to get in the same group as the worst team in the league and Team WE, and they did show that they were better than WE, and who knows, maybe this is the 12th or 13th or 14th best team in the league. Maybe they're not number 15. Maybe they're not bottom 2, but I'm still going to kind of hold on to my preseason analysis when it came to those two teams and say, you know, LGD got super lucky to get WE in a group, and I think that they will be a bottom 2 team, and in my opinion, they'll be one of the 2 out by the end of the spring split. They will not get to play in summer, according to my power rankings. But let's go ahead and talk about why their lineup is looking like Saucy in the top lane, Climber in the jungle, Zhao Qinghua in the mid lane, Xiaoya at AD carry, and YCX at support. This is obviously a very inexperienced team. This is a team with not a lot of, like, proven LPL talent. In fact, they have basically no proven LPL talent. Xiaoya is the only player who played anything before winter. Zhao Qinghua, I think, had a cup of coffee starting for LGD in a couple of games here or there, but Xiaoya was really the only one with any sort of actual experience in the LPL before winter split, and he wasn't very good in that limited amount of experience. And then LGD shows up here for winter, pretty low expectations, and things go basically exactly according to plan. They're able to beat up on WE because that team is an absolute disaster, but in the matchups against Top Esports and Anyone's Legend, 2 teams that are actually very good, 2 of the top, 3 teams in my opinion in the LPL, they're just not able to hold up to that, and they end up not really being able to compete. And I think it's in a lot of the ways that we kind of expected. I do think there are interesting pieces on this team. I think Climber is a really, really interesting jungler. I think I view him pretty similarly to how I view a lot of the supports that we talked about earlier, players like Nickit, players like Jway, that I think have the potential to really break out and be superstars at this level, but their surrounding circumstance, their surrounding core is likely just not going to be able to get them there. Even someone like a Jiang on Ultra Prime, I think, is kind of in that same vein. Climber is a player that I think in a better situation, if he were given better players around him, could actually probably perform pretty well. I really like the tape I've seen out of him, and I definitely think he is like the future star of the group of players that is here, but it's just going to be difficult for me to imagine that he's ever going to be able to fully unlock that on this version of LGD, because I just don't think you're going to have a lot of winning lanes all that consistently. It's not to say everybody on this team is a disaster. I think that there are players you can point to in a positive light, but Climber is definitely this team's best player, both now and looking forward to the future. I think the solo lanes are fine. Like, Saucy and Zhao Qinghua, I think, are fine. Again, like, not the best or not the worst. Zhao Qinghua has had a couple of games every once in a while in the mid lane where you can feel kind of okay when he's been starting, but he's also super inconsistent as a player. He's pretty one-dimensional in terms of the style that he wants to go for. If he can't win in lane, he's probably not going to do all that much in the mid game. If he does win, he can be pretty active. Him and Climber were definitely a duo that was looking to try and make plays in the mid game, and that was encouraging to me, especially when they did pick up that win over WE in winter. But I think outside of that, it's just really hard to project that either of these two are going to be able able to dominate enough, especially consistently, to be able to rise LGD above this number 4 ranking. But I think if this team is going to be better than, number 15 or like the worst team in the league, if they're going to go into Group Nirvana and actually be, a team that fights it out to try to get top 2 in Group Nirvana, I think a lot of that is probably going to come through Climber, and I think a lot of that's probably going to come through Zhao Qinghua. I kind of included Sassy in that conversation because I do think that, at least mechanically speaking, he is interesting. I don't really feel all that good about him in terms of like having a ridiculously high ceiling. I don't really see a superstar player here. We've seen some top laners come through the system before that I think have, high ceilings that either have or haven't been able to reach it. Obviously, Xiaoshu for RNG is kind of the obvious one, but even someone like Harry that we already talked about on OMG, like he came in and there was like a clear expectation that he would get better and, kind of grow into that role, which didn't end up happening. I don't really feel that way with Sassy. I feel like he's a lot more of a completed player in terms of where his growth arc is, and I just don't think he's ever going to be all that sensational. Again, maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to be wrong when it comes to that. I think top laners can be pretty volatile at the LPL level, but at least that's my read for now. And that's your top side, and that's what I would consider to be the good part of the team. You have Climber and Zhao Qinghua that I think could theoretically do something. Sassy, I don't think, is like the worst player in the world, but again, not like a superstar in that regard. And then you get to the bot lane, which I do think is a major problem. If WE didn't have Taiyun and Vampire as their bot lane duo, Xiaoya and YCX would pretty clearly be the worst bot lane duo in the entire league. They just don't really have a ton of upside. Xiaoya is probably the single worst player on this team. I get that, ranking-wise, it doesn't necessarily indicate that. Basically, everybody around LGD ended up going down one spot. YCX dropping to 15, Sassy dropping to 14. Everybody else kind of fell. I think Xiaoya was the worst in winter. I just think that the bottom, it's hard to go much further down than number 15. He was already the lowest rated player on this team, and I think he definitely backed that up. I am just not impressed with Xiaoya. I don't think he's a particularly good player, and I think YCX is the definition of like a below average support. Again, maybe things end up changing, but I really don't have a lot of confidence in this bot lane. They just weren't able to win all that consistently 2v2. They don't really offer anything in team fights. They're not good skirmishers. I just don't really see a pathway for them to be relevant in this league, especially in the group that they are in right now. And so, in terms of my expectations, in terms of what I'm kind of, expecting out of this team, I expect them to be a bottom 2 team in the league. Again, maybe they're top 13, top 14. I definitely think they're better than a team like Team WE. And so if WE is like guaranteed to lock in one of those bottom 2 spots, which obviously they're definitely not, but if they're expected to be a team that locks in one of those bottom 2 spots, then is LGD fighting it out with teams like Ultra Prime and like FunPlus Phoenix and a lot of the teams that are kind of around that area? Is LGD fighting it out with them? Yeah, I do think that theoretically, like, they could pick up some steam if Climber really starts to win some games, if the solo laners are better than I'm expecting, if the bot lane can hold up really at all. Like, they can be better than the bad teams. They're not all that far off from being where they are, but definitely in terms of my expectations and my projections going into the spring split, I think this team definitely has to be worried about being one of the first 2 teams eliminated because I'm really just not sure where their floor even is. Then moving on to the team I have in third in this group, and if we talked about Thunder Talk being the team that really overperformed their expectations the most in the winter split, this is definitely the team that underperformed their expectations the most. It's LNG Esports coming in at number 12 in my power rankings, clearly outside of the top 10, and quite frankly, they could be even lower. They were definitely worse than the 12th best team in the LPL in the winter split. They had so many issues, but you have to imagine that there are enough good players on this team that they're going to be able to stabilize in some way, but I really hate to say this because this is not something I loved. I know people in the comments like to turn around and say that I love to say this on the channel, but I don't love like being like, oh, I told you so. I don't love patting myself on the back in such a like overly congratulatory manner. Like, it's just not something that I try to do all that much on this channel, but man, I had a lot of hits when it came to this team. There are basically 2 players on this team that I liked going into the year and 3 that I didn't. The 3 that I didn't like all played really horrible and all played significantly below expectations. They've all kind of been anti-channel darlings, or at least 2 of them have been anti-channel darlings that I've pushed back on for 2 or 3 or 4 years in some cases for some of them. And the other 2 players I think played fine, and they continue to be relatively well ranked in my power rankings, and that's really the end of the story. Is LNG is just a team where I think the bad players are really kind of holding them back, similarly to how we've talked about some teams earlier in the video. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zika in the top lane, Weiwei in the jungle, Hai Chao in the mid lane, Photic at AD carry, and Zhuo at support. I mean, let's get the elephants out of the room. Like, Weiwei and Photic have kind of been on the anti-K-Man bucket for a really long time. I've really pushed back on both of these players. I've definitely been called a hater for both of them in the past, specifically Photic, who I would consider to be like the #1 player that I've pushed back on, like the player that I'm probably most famous for pushing back on in this channel. Honestly, I just hate to say it, it has only aged well. Like, I feel like I kind of nailed Photic back in 2022 when I talked about his time on Victory 5 and said, like, hey, Rookie and PP God are doing literally everything for this team. Photic is, like, not thinking and just playing the game. Like, he has the easiest job of any AD carry in the entire league, and everybody's saying that he's, like, the next superstar at the position. I just didn't see it, and then obviously those guys leave, and he now has to play on his own. And as I talked about in 2023 summer, he graded out as the single worst player in the LPL by all of the metrics that I track. He just was unplayable in terms of what he was for that Ninjas in Pyjamas team. He actively held them back from being relevant, and obviously they ended up overcoming that because Angel and Shadow were really good as a mid-jungle duo for that team, but Photic was an absolute disaster and did everything he could to absolutely tank that roster. He showed some promise and actually some good signs in 2024 spring. I would consider that his best split ever, at least from my perspective. That was the best tape he had ever put down, and then he went right back to being Photic in 2024 summer, where he was awful once again, was actively a huge detriment to that Ninjas in Pyjamas team, and really held them back from being nearly as relevant as they deserved to be with the roster that they had. He comes over here to LNG because this entire team ends up striking out so much in the offseason. They go after this the Scout Pays combo and end up landing neither because they go over to JD Gaming and they have to, you know, try and rebound. At one point, it was looking like this team was going to be, I think it was locked in on the database to be Zika, Tion, Scout, Pays, and Crisp, and somehow that turned into Zico, Weiwei, Haichao, Photic, and Zhuo, which is just an absolute disaster for them, obviously. But, you know, Photic and Zhuo were arguably the worst bot lane performance-wise in the entirety of the spring split. These guys are just bad. Photic is not a good AD carry. I have him at number 12 in terms of my AD carry rankings. He can go lower than this. If you want him lower than a lot of the players I have lower than him, go ahead, man. I'm all out on Photic. I'm not even going to pretend like I think he can be an average player anymore. For a long time on this channel, for a lot of this channel's history, I really tried to find a middle ground between what my thoughts on these players were and what the general consensus on these players were, and people just thought of Photic pretty highly, and so I had him around number 7 or number 8 in my AD carry rankings. He's just not that player. I have to stick to my gut. I have to stick to what I'm seeing, and being a Photic hater for so long has really paid off, unfortunately for me. And you could say similar things for Weiwei. I've certainly talked down Weiwei basically his entire tenure in the LPL. He's just a very one-dimensional jungler, and we've talked about that before, but somehow he doesn't necessarily get that same kind of reputation. He is either the primary option in terms of the resources on the team, like the primary carry, or he's bad. Like, there is no in-between. He made a World Finals on Weibo Gaming a couple of years ago, and everybody was like, well, he must be a good jungler. He's in World Finals. Go watch that Worlds. He got carried to that World Finals. He was the best performing player, quote-unquote, in their route in the finals when they got absolutely destroyed. He certainly was the one doing the most amount for the team in the finals, but getting there, it was not Weiwei. He was not good at Worlds in 2023, and then he really hasn't been all that good domestically. I continue to really push back. You know, I kind of warned people in 2024 that this team was going to take a major step back, that Weiwei was not going to mesh well with Scout, and you know what? Playstyle differences ended up absolutely collapsing them in, and now that he has to be a number 1 option, he's not good enough to do that anymore, and so, yeah, he is just a slightly below average jungler at this level. I've just never been a fan of Weiwei or Photic, and I think that's really playing out. Unfortunately, Zhuo kind of gets lumped into this. I think Zhuo is a better player than Photic, and I think he's probably a better player than Weiwei. I think he has interesting parts as a support. I don't think he's like a complete disaster and unplayable at this level, but he's certainly not good, and I think the grade kind of reflects that. The two players that I do like on this team, though, I like Zika, I like Haichao. I'm even raising Zika up 1 spot. He's going to go up to my number 5 top laner. I don't think he was particularly good in the winter split. It wasn't like he was doing a lot, but honestly, like, going back and watching the tape, it's really easy to just say this guy's mega trapped, and if he was on a better team, he'd be fine. Like, I feel confident that Zika is the same exact player that he was a year ago or 2 years ago when he was succeeding at this level. He's just on a team that can't really do anything anymore, and so his numbers are going to look a lot worse. His laning stats are still entirely fine, and again, I think the tape does indicate that he still absolutely has carry potential in him. It's just games were so lost for LNG that there wasn't a lot he could do. And then there's Haichao in the mid lane. What a breakout 2024 for Haichao. He ends up coming over to LNG, kind of being the replacement for Scout. We thought he was going to be able to stabilize this team. He was awful in winter. He was like really, really bad, but I have to hope that it's a bit more of an outlier because I do think he has kind of shown that natural sense of progression over the course of his career. I would be shocked if it all kind of came crashing down. Now, again, maybe it's just the structure of this team. Bot lane is awful. Jungle is not very good. It's a hard situation for Haichao to play in the mid lane, and maybe in a different situation he would play better, and maybe that's just going to tank LNG for the whole year, but for now, I have to rely on the fact that I do still like the solo laners on this team, and I do still think they can be good, but bot lane is a disaster. Jungle, I just don't think is ever going to be a positive for them in terms of the way they've constructed this. You know, LNG could be worse than 12. They were worse than the number 12 team in the LPL. I think this is around where they're going to fall if they're a team that ends up in Group Nirvana, but, you know, being a top 2 team in Group Nirvana, I'm not going to be all that surprised. I think they should be more talented than a lot of the teams down there, but if they're a team that gets eliminated first, like finishing bottom 2, are we really going to be all that surprised at this point? What have they done to show that they're not a bottom 2 team in the LPL up until this point? They really haven't done anything, and so they have a lot to prove here, and honestly, it could be an absolute disaster year for an org that's been kind of a perennial Worlds contender for a little while now. But now jumping into the top 2 of Group D, and coming in at number 2 again should be pretty obvious, at least in terms of the results that we got from Winter. It's gonna be Invictus Gaming, and this is not how I would have lined this team up going into the spring split in terms of expectations. I didn't think that they were going to struggle so much out of the gate, but there are like real problems with this team that I think are currently holding them back from being anywhere near the top 4. I think a lot has to go right for them to be able to push forward. A lot of the things that went wrong in Winter have to be corrected as quickly as possible, and we'll kind of talk about that because a couple of these players just straight up were not good at all in the Winter split, and if they're going to be better in spring, they just have to have better individual performances. You have to be better in and out of lane. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that. Their lineup is, of course, the Shy in the top lane, Jeje in the jungle, Rookie in the mid lane, Gala at AD carry, and Mako at support. This was supposed to be the big super team reuniting for Invictus Gaming. You're bringing back the solo lane duo that brought this organization a title, a world title in 2018, and then, of course, an LPL title in 2019. You're bringing on Gala and Mako, who have been 2 of the best performers in their individual roles in the world over the past couple of years. Certainly 2 of the more consistent players. You have Jeje, who, while he didn't have the best 2024, had been a fantastic jungler up until that point, and everything was kind of a disaster for Edward Gaming in 2024, and so you really felt like this team was kind of built to succeed as long as they could be, I guess, synergistic. And the problem for IG, and the reason that I am actually concerned about this team, is the issue was not synergy. It wasn't the fact that they were playing different styles of game and that you were getting individual, like, weird communication errors or just not understanding how to play mid games out. Like, these guys were just losing. Like, their mechanical talent was not nearly as good as it needed to be in order for them to go up against actually good teams. Like, they were fine beating up on the bad teams in Group D, but when they faced, like, actual good teams, when they faced Ninjas in Pyjamas, who I don't even think is, like, a particularly excellent team, or when they went into the playoffs and faced Top Esports, they felt so outclassed, they felt so overmatched in terms of the talent on those 2 teams that is what's concerning to me moving forward for Invictus. And I think that really starts with Rookie in the mid lane, who, I'm gonna be honest, was just bad in Winter. There was no explanation for why Rookie played the way that he did, but he was like a bottom, I don't know, bottom half mid laner for sure, maybe bottom 5 mid laner in the LPL in terms of raw production and what he was putting out on the Rift. I was just so unimpressed with his tape. And the problem, the big overarching issue, is we saw this before. This is not the first time the Rookie has underperformed like this. This is how he was performing in 2023 on Top Esports, and we were hoping that that was just kind of a down year for him. Obviously, he ends up going to Top Esports from Victory 5 in 2022, where things were really going his way. TES doesn't work out. Like, that entire team just underperforms in a lot of different ways. Jackie Love does his best to carry that 2023 team, and it doesn't really end up landing, but he goes back to the Victory 5 organization, of course, Ninjas in Pyjamas, in 2024, and things do turn around for him. He's once again one of the best mid laners in the world. He's performing very similarly and very comparably to players like Showmaker over in the LCK, which I talked about a lot on this channel, and you were kind of hoping that with a good roster around him on IG that was going to work again, but man, it's just not. This feels so much like Top Esports Rookie, and that is the most concerning part. If he's not going to be a top 4 or a top 5 mid laner, the upside of this team immediately plummets, and unfortunately that was the case in the Winter split. Again, he has to be better. The other player to me that just kind of has to be better, or the lane that has to be better, and I think this might be counterintuitive based off the player rankings, is bot lane. Gala and Mako were just not who you thought they would be in the Winter split. You thought that they were going to be one of, if not the best bot lane in the world. We certainly thought they were going to be at the very least in the conversation for being one of the best bot lanes in the world, and it just did not happen. Mako in particular was not good in Winter, and that's weird because I have him as the highest graded player here, but first off, again, not every position is graded equally. Mako ends up coming in, I believe, with like a B+-ish grade, and that just gets him to number 2 because On is the only player who I have anywhere in the A's at an A-, and even then, it's not like On was particularly good in Winter. Like, support is just really up in the air right now in the LPL, well, and I just trust Mako's history a bit more. But, you know, on top of that, I also would expect these two to be able to bounce back. I do think playstyle-wise, there is a lot of reasons to like Gala and Mako as a duo, and honestly, they were the lane I was the most, like, convinced was going to be good. I was the most sure of going into the year when you talked about this team in the offseason. Like, Rookie, the Shy, like, Jeja, wasn't, like, entirely positive what you were going to get out of them because they're inconsistent players naturally, but Gala and Mako are the consistency of this team, and yet that was not the case in winter. They have to be better. Mako in particular has to continue to perform like one of the best supports in the world, and Gala needs to be able to step up and actually, like, be a secondary carry on this team. The issue for him is he was asked to be a primary carry a lot for IG in the winter split, and that's just not Gala. He can do that. Like, he's very Gumayushi in that regard. Those are obviously the two players that I've compared so much over the course of their careers, where I think they thrive in situations where they're asked to be the number 2 guy on a team in terms of the resources. They can be the number 1 guy. Guma in particular has really shown that he can be the number 2 guy or number 1 guy on a team for an extended period of time. But Gala, I think, is going to thrive if Rookie or the Shy ends up stepping up and being like a primary carry in those spots. That's why it's even more important that Rookie has a turnaround. But I think Gala and Mako are fine, and I still can't grade them below this in terms of their individual roles because I just think the talent is too good for them. And, you know, Rookie has that history of being inconsistent. These players really don't. So I imagine they're going to be fine. You start to get to the top side of the map, the Shy is the Shy. He was honestly fine in winter. He was not the problem for this team, but his inherent inconsistencies just lead me to ranking him a bit lower than the other top laners that I actually do kind of like. Again, nothing against the Shy. If he ends up performing like a top 3 or top 4 guy, I'm not going to be shocked. There will be some games where he performs like the number 12 or number 13 top laner in the league, but you live with it. Like, it's the Shy. He's not holding this team back. What was the positive part of Invictus in the winter split was Jeja in the jungle, who was by far this team's best player, and it was not even remotely close. He was really good in winter, and that's a really encouraging trait because he was the player that was coming off of the worst year previously. Of course, the Shy didn't really play the previous year, and so it's definitely, you know, a bit more like, you know, you can't really count that, but Rookie was awesome on Ninjas in Pyjamas. Gala was excellent on LNG. Mako was a world-class player on Top Esports. Jeja was coming off of a year where he was basically sidelined with injury for a majority of it on LGD Gaming and really needed to kind of prove that he deserved to be on a top team. He did exactly that. He actively carried this team across multiple games, even when Rookie was laning really poorly in the mid lane, when Gala and Mako weren't really clicking as a 2v2, when the Shy wasn't taking over. On the top side, this team would often have gold leads purely just off of how good Jeja's mid games were. And I think if that's going to continue and you get step-ups from somebody else on this team, like, they're still a top 5 or a top 4 potentially team in the LPL. I think Jeja alone kind of gives you that kind of ceiling if he's going to play the way that he did. The problem is you need one of these lanes to step up, and more specifically, it's kind of gotta be Rookie in order for the rest of this team to work the way that you designed it to. Mako is a roamer. He's good in lane. He's a very good 2v2 player. One of the reasons we've always hyped up Mako on this channel is because he is that jack of all trades, master of all. He can really do whatever style you need him to do, but Gala loves to play weak side, and if that's going to be the case, play for Rookie. Try to get him ahead. Play for the middle of the map. Jeja and Rookie, if they can be a dynamic mid-jungle duo, can absolutely take over this league, but that's kind of still the win condition for IG, and if they're going to perform the way they did in winter, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get that off. Again, if you have anybody on this team step up, their outlook immediately goes up, and I'm kind of expecting that to happen with the bot lane, which is why they stay at number 6 instead of going to number 7, but there is also a world in which this team is not nearly as good as they're supposed to be, and they're not in Worlds contention. I think both are realistic outcomes, and I guess at this point, we're just interested to see which way it ends up heading. But that's going to bring us to our final team of the video, and the team that I have in first place in Group D, and that is, of course, LGD Gaming. I feel pretty confident that this is a top 4 team in the LPL. I think that they are not particularly consistent. I have concerns about them that keep them out of the top 3 for me, but it's pretty clear that top 4 is just a very achievable thing for LGD Gaming, and honestly, any result below that would probably be below their expectations because their top-end talent is ridiculous and is living up to the hype. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Ale in the top lane, Shun in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Missing at support. We can start with the probably controversial one here a bit first. Pays as my number 1 AD carry in the LPL right now. Everything you could have ever wanted to see from Pays out of him outside of the Gen G system was what he showed to you in the winter split. Like, everything you could ever want to see out of an AD carry. He was not only option number 1 on this team, but he was able to generate a lot of those leads himself and and in the 2v2 lane, obviously part of that goes to Missing, but we'll talk about it in a second. Another reason why I'm so impressed with Paze is because Missing was making mistake after mistake in the winter split, and Paze was still able to basically recover from all of it and push his team forward. He was dominating skirmishes. He was one of the best team fighters in the entire region, regardless of role. Like, anything you could have ever wanted to see out of Paze coming over to the LPL, he absolutely showed you. Now, the only concern here is that it is such a limited sample size that he didn't really get a ton of games to show whether or not he's going to be able to do that at a consistent level, but Paze was already playing like one of the best AD carries in the world for Gen G over the past 2 years, as I've talked about a lot on this channel. People like to pretend it was just the system around Paze that was creating him. This guy's mechanics are insane. He's gotten infinitely better in lane. He was already an elite team fighter at 17 years old, and now he can actually play out the entire game. Like, he just does everything at a ridiculously high level. He's been a top 10 player in the world for a while now, basically 3 straight years, and I don't see any reason for that not to just continue the way that it is. He right now is in borderline conversations for being the most talented AD carry in the world. I'm not saying he's the best. I'm certainly not trying to hang my hat on that, because I think that there are a lot of, AD carries that deserve to be in that conversation, but Paze is my number 1 AD carry in the LPL, and I do think that he's proven at both the LCK and the LPL level that he can compete with anybody, and especially because he is the primary option on this team, he might get even more chance to shine than he has the previous years. And the other player that you have to point out in a positive way is Scout. Like, these two were a duo basically the entire offseason. They were kind of shopping themselves around to teams as a duo, most notably to LNG and to JD Gaming. JDG end up winning their services, and Scout ends up being, like, really good for this team. People will criticize some of the playoff performances, but honestly, I'm not worried about Scout. The only reason he's going down one is because I think Cream really has proven that he is that good. Scout is the same player we thought he was going into the year. A very good mid laner, one of the players that's going to be competing to be a top 5 mid laner in the world, and him and Paze as a duo, like the top end talent, the core that they built this entire team around, they are living up to the expectations. I would say the other players are kind of hit or miss. Jun can still be very feast or famine in the jungle. He's obviously a very risky player, but man, he hits a lot more than he misses. I feel very good about putting Shun above Wei in my player rankings at the beginning of the year. That has very much been justified so far in 2025, where Shun has just been a better player than Wei in basically every way. It's been pretty obvious to see that, but I don't think Shun's ever going to be a top 1 or a top 2 guy. I just don't know if he's ever going to have that consistency, but as a player who can be like the number 3 option on a team like JDG, I'm perfectly fine with Shun in the role that he's in. He's a very talented player, and he's really kind of solidified himself as a player who needs to be on top tier teams. I think it would be criminal if he wasn't, so I feel good about that. Ale is going to drop 1 spot. He's going to kind of get lost there in the shuffle to the player that he replaced on this team in Flandre, who jumps up to that number 3 spot. I was a bit disappointed by Ale in the winter split. His group stage, his regular season was totally fine. I really had no major issues with that. He played the way that I thought he would. It was the playoff series where I felt like, especially that one against AL where it's like, you need to be better here. That one against Top Esports where he got outplayed by 369. Like, those are concerning traits, and Ale is a player that I think it's worth noting has not been, like, crazy successful at the LPL level, even if he has a ridiculous amount of talent. I'm still willing to kind of bank that he'll be able to bounce back, but there are some concerns on the top side that they did get worse going into this year, going from Flandre and Sheer to Ale, and that's really not something I was expecting. And then Missing is the other player. I'm super out on Missing at this point. Like, I hate to say it, this dude just runs it at times. Like, I don't want to say Barrel-esque, because Barrel's been playing a lot better this year, and I think that general vibe is just a little different. Like, he's not a Hylissang-esque player, but, like, Missing does not have elite mechanics. Like, there in no universe can you say that Missing has elite mechanics. He never really had elite mechanics. I think what the problem for Missing is the meta has really shifted into a way where he is no longer an elite support. When he was playing at his absolute best, when you're talking 2023 Missing, that was a meta where you could get away basically playing like 2v2 lane heavy enchanters, like, poke mages every game. Like, if you really wanted to get away with it, obviously engagers have always been relevant in the meta, but he's never been like a huge engager player. He's definitely more of somebody who wants to play for the 2v2 than try to play for skirmishes and team fights. The problem is that is not the meta right now. Every single meta support, or at least all of the top meta supports, are all engagers, and Missing is just worse than his contemporaries at these engaged supports, and that's been proven over and over again. And I think until he ends up fixing that, like, it's really hard to rank him above the number 6 support in the region. Again, maybe he could even go lower than that, but I do think the upside is definitely still there. Not every single game is bad, and trying to, say everything that's happening in the bot lane is Paze and not Missing, I think is disingenuous. There are parts of this 2v2 that still are going really well for Missing. The issue is the consistency is just gone on, and I don't think he has that same kind of impact in mid-game fights and in late-game team fights as maybe he's had over the past couple of years. He certainly doesn't feel like an elite caliber support, and especially if he keeps making the mistakes that he's been making recently, it's just really frustrating. But Paze and Scout are so good that it's really hard for me to imagine this team is any worse than number 4. Paze right now feels like a top 3 player in the LPL. If that's the case, they're going to have a pretty high floor. Scout's a really good player, and I think Shun's just going to win games for you if Ole can bounce back, and if Missing can really like step up, if Missing and Paze can turn into what Ruler and Missing was for a very long time. Or I guess specifically for 2023, 2024 was a little up and down, but specifically for 2023, then I do think JDG can be a top 1 or a top 2 team in the LPL. The issue is that some of the players that you're looking for a bounce back from, specifically Missing, have been on a downward trajectory, and I think that will continue. So we'll see. This might just be Paze and Scout versus the world like they kind of were in winter, but as we saw, like that was a top 3 finish, and they didn't get great performances out of top or support. So even at the bare minimum, this team is going to be scary, and I think it could even get worse throughout the year. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL split number 2 spring split primer and power rankings video. Up on the screen now, the full overview of all 4 of the groups, all of the teams listed with where I personally power rank them from number 1 to number 16. I kind of said at the beginning of this video, I don't think this will go 2 hours. This isn't a 2-hour long video. Oops, my bad, guys. I always severely underestimate my ability to yap, and I know you guys appreciate it. You told me at the beginning of the year that you like these longer form videos, so I do appreciate it. But again, up on the screen, my projected results. Top 2 teams I'm projecting to go forward into Group Ascend. Bottom team in each group I'm projecting to go to Group Nirvana. And then of the 3 teams I have in 3rd place, I have Edward Gaming and Royal Never Give Up being able to move on to Group Ascend, and that would mean OMG and LNG are the teams to move down. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. We are not going to agree on everything. There's going to be a team or a player that I have way higher than you or way lower than you. I'm curious what your thoughts and opinions are. Of course, as a reminder, I know I'm saying this way too late into the video and people have already left a ton of comments like this, but if you're going to tell me that a player is too low or too high, let me know who they should be above or who they should be below. It's all nice and good to say that, oh, this player is clearly a top 7 player in their role. But if you have 9 players who were top 7 in their role, like that doesn't work out, man. You know what I mean? Like there are a lot of good players in some of these roles. So tell me who you think should be higher and who you think should be lower and why, and who they would replace. I'm always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on that down in the comment section below. But that's gonna do it for today's video. I do appreciate you guys watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering every single game of the LPL. It's best of 1 double round robin in these groups. We'll be covering them each in 4-day intervals. So we'll cover day 1 for all of these groups, and then day 2 for all of these groups, and then move on to, further stuff. But we're gonna be covering everything on this channel. So if you're interested, hit subscribe and hit that bell. Of course, we're going to be covering all 3 of the other major regions as well. So LTA North, LEC, LCK, the regular ones that we cover on this channel, and NACL is going to be starting up Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, we're going to be covering all of it on the channel. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all